It's Christopher, and in today's episode, I'm looking at the darkest animal deaths ever recorded. From a seasoned hunter who wandered too close to a grizzly, guarding its kill, to a woman who left the safety of a trail, walked straight into predator territory, and met an unexpected end. It was March 14th, 2015, a private game reserve in South Africa's Limpopo region. Open grassland, scattered acacia trees, the kind of place that looks peaceful from inside a vehicle. The road is unpaved, dusty, and long. Cell signal disappears past the main gate. Darvel Ose was 38, a logistics coordinator from outside Johannesburg who had saved nearly 2 years for this trip. His wife Priya, their teenage son, and their 13-year-old daughter Nami were all with him. He'd booked a self-drive package, signed a liability waiver, sat through a basic orientation at the gate, and that was it. No guide, no escort, no backup, zero prior safari experience. But he was confident. That confidence is what made this trip dangerous before it even started. The reserve sits in a semi-arid bushveld zone where mid-March temperatures regularly hit 97 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Predator activity peaks in the late morning and again near dusk. The road Darvel was on cuts through the southern section, territory shared by at least 2 resident lion prides. About 40 minutes into the drive, the engine cut out. Overheated, a known issue with that specific rental unit that nobody mentioned at check-in. He tried restarting it. Nothing. Priya checked her phone. No signal. They sat in the heat waiting for something to change. No sounds, no movement, just heat and the occasional creak of the cooling engine. At some point, the family stopped talking altogether. Here's the detail that changes everything. The rear passenger window on Nami's side had a broken regulator. It wouldn't stay up on its own, and in the heat with the engine off, Darvel had lowered it about halfway to give her air, maybe 10 to 11 inches of open glass. Darvel had been meaning to raise it back up. The orientation had one rule above everything else: stay in the vehicle. Keep windows closed. It was on the laminated sheet clipped to the sun visor. He had read it. He just hadn't acted on it. 20 minutes after the engine died, shapes appeared in the grass about 60 feet out. 5 lionesses and 2 younger males. They approached without urgency. No stalking, no aggression, just slow curiosity. One climbed onto the hood. The family stayed completely still. For the next 8 minutes, the pride worked the vehicle the way they work anything unfamiliar. One lioness pressed her face flat against the driver's side glass. Another mouthed the front tire, then lost interest. A third dragged its jaw slowly along the door seams, drawn by salt from handprints, human scent baked into the exterior. The family watched without making a sound. It didn't look like predation. It looked like investigation. That distinction would not save them. One of the younger males drifted toward the rear passenger side. The window was already most of the way down. He pressed his nose along the door, then rose up on his forelimbs and pushed his head through the opening, not forcing anything, just following the gap that was already there. Nami was sitting right there. She flinched back against the seat. That movement, that sudden shift, was enough. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. The lion bit down on her left shoulder and the left side of her neck simultaneously and pulled. Priya grabbed her daughter's legs. Darvel threw himself into the back seat. Their son pressed against the opposite door, hands over his ears, not looking. The grip didn't release. Nami was pulled through to her waist before the lion repositioned its bite to her upper neck, severing the vessels on the left side. She was fully outside within seconds. Darvel found the emergency beacon clipped to the dash and activated it. The pride didn't scatter. The male moved into the grass with Nami. The others stayed around the SUV, pressing against the doors, moving along the perimeter, for another 22 minutes before drifting off. The beacon was transmitting. Help was coming. He just didn't know when. A reserve response team reached them 47 minutes later. Nami's body was recovered about 35 feet into the grass. She had been dead within minutes of being pulled out. The postmortem confirmed exsanguination from lacerations to the left carotid artery and jugular vein. The lowered window and the absence of a guide were both listed as contributing factors. The case was closed as a fatal animal attack. Nami was 13 years old. It was March 18th, 2016. The late afternoon heat had barely broken along the Tana River in Kenya. The air sat thick and humid, carrying the smell of wet soil and slow-moving water. The sky had shifted from its midday white to a deeper, hazier tone as the sun dropped toward the tree line, casting long shadows across the bank. The river ran dark that time of year, silt heavy from seasonal rains upstream, the surface opaque and offering nothing to the eye beneath it. Daniel Mwangi was 29 years old, a local resident who had been using the same stretch of riverbank as a washing spot for an extended period. The location was practical, a gently sloping section of bank where the water was shallow enough to crouch at the edge without wading in. He had used it regularly, at similar times of day, in the same crouched position, without incident. That consistency had done what routine always does in dangerous environments. It had removed the instinct for caution. The spot felt known. It felt predictable, and I think that's the part that gets me most. Not the attack itself, the routine. The fact that nothing bad had ever happened there was the reason something eventually did. He arrived as the light was beginning to change, crouched at the water's edge, and extended his upper body forward over the surface. His head and torso were within reach of the shallows. The water gave no indication of what was already there. What Daniel could not have seen, and what the river's surface gave no indication of, was the animal that had been present in those shallows long before he arrived. Nile crocodiles do not hunt by chasing. They hunt by waiting, and they are extraordinarily patient. Nile crocodiles are among the most efficient ambush predators on the planet. Adult males commonly exceed 16 feet in length and can weigh over 1,500 pounds. Their bodies are built for concealment, low profile, dark-scaled, and capable of remaining completely motionless beneath the surface for extended periods, sometimes hours, with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, or submerged entirely in shallow water, invisible against the riverbed. In murky conditions, they are effectively undetectable. I want you to actually think about that for a second. You could be standing in water with a 1,500-pound crocodile and have no idea. None. The surface gives you nothing. A crocodile can be present in water that a person is standing in and remain completely unseen until the moment it moves. The strike is not a gradual approach. It is an explosion, a lunge from shallow water with jaws that generate bite forces exceeding 5,000 pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded of any living animal. The attack sequence is immediate and mechanical. Clamp, drag, roll. Each one follows the last within seconds, and by the time the first has occurred, the outcome is already determined. The crocodile had been positioned in the shallows ahead of Daniel, motionless and undetected. It lunged without warning. The jaws clamped onto his left shoulder and the side of his head, the upper jaw across the temporal region, the lower locked beneath the shoulder joint. The grip was immediate and total. I think about that more than anything else. Not the size of the animal, just the grip and what it offers you to work with. Nothing. The crocodile pulled him off the bank and into the shallows in a single rearward motion. He was submerged within seconds. The death roll came after. Once there was no footing, no resistance. A full body rotation that sheared the soft tissue of the neck and shoulder through torque rather than direct pressure. By the time it happened, drowning was already the mechanism. The trauma followed. The river returned to stillness. That's the part I can't get past. No struggle at the surface, just the water going quiet again. Crocodiles do not consume prey immediately after killing. They cache it, wedging the body beneath submerged roots, rocks, or debris, and returning to feed over subsequent days as decomposition softens the tissue and makes it easier to process. When Daniel's remains were eventually recovered from the river, the face had sustained extensive soft tissue loss across the most exposed regions. The damage was consistent with two distinct processes: the mechanical trauma of the initial attack, the bite force, the death roll, the shearing of tissue against bone, and post-mortem feeding concentrated on the areas of the body that were most accessible and least structurally protected. The face, in both cases, bore the greatest consequence. It was the first point of contact, and it was the first point of return. It was January 22nd, 2019. Matabeleland North in Zimbabwe sits under the full weight of a southern African. Summer in January. The heat builds from early morning and distorts the air above open ground. The vegetation in January is at its densest. The rains have been running since November, and the bush has responded with growth that fills every gap between trees and reduces visibility to a fraction of what it is in the dry season. The ground is uneven, cut through with drainage lines, and scattered with roots and rocks that make fast movement dangerous. Richard Hale was 58 years old, a British hunter with decades of experience pursuing dangerous game. He had hunted elephant before, understood the demands of the frontal brain shot, placed with precision into a moving target under significant psychological pressure, and had done everything correctly up to the moment the elephant committed to its charge. Even in that moment, he had done almost everything correctly. Almost was not enough. By his side was Tendai Moyo was 50 years old, a Zimbabwean professional hunter who had spent his career in the mixed woodland of Matabeleland, guiding hunters after elephant and buffalo in terrain he knew with the intimacy of someone who had walked it for 30 years. He knew the signs of escalating agitation, knew the difference between a mock charge and a committed one, and knew that the window between a committed charge and contact is measured in seconds that feel much shorter than they are. The African elephant is the largest land animal on Earth, and an adult bull can weigh over 6 tons and accelerate from a standing start to a full charge in a distance and time that consistently surprises people who have not seen it happen. The frontal brain shot must be placed into a target roughly the size of a large grapefruit, located deep within a skull that has evolved specifically to absorb and deflect impact. The skull of an adult bull elephant is a complex structure of bone and air cavities that distributes force in ways that make a slightly off-center shot deflect rather than penetrate. At 25 meters, with the animal already moving, the difference between a stopping shot and a deflection is a matter of centimeters. It's almost impossible for me to imagine hitting that target perfectly under such pressure. They had been tracking the bull since early morning. When they found it, it was already showing signs of agitation. Head elevated, ears spread wide, trunk curling inward. Tendai advised repositioning for a better angle. Richard held his position at approximately 25 meters, waiting for the animal to settle. The elephant did not settle. It initiated what appeared, in the first fraction of a second, to be a mock charge. Then it committed. The transition from mock charge to committed charge is not always clearly telegraphed. The indicators are subtle and occur in the same fraction of a second that the charge begins. At 25 meters, the time between commitment and contact is approximately 2 to 3 seconds. As the elephant closed the distance, dust erupted around its feet and partially obscured the anatomical landmarks the frontal brain shot requires. Richard fired as the reference shifted. The shot landed slightly off the brain, not by much, not by a distance visible to an observer, but by enough. The bullet deflected on the heavy skull structure. Rather than penetrating to the brain, the elephant did not slow. I can hardly wrap my head around how precise and unforgiving that anatomy is. Tendai fired immediately, stepping laterally to change his angle. But the mixed woodland disrupted the clean shooting lane that movement required, and the angle he was forced to take was not the angle he needed. Richard attempted to cycle another round, but the ground beneath him was uneven, and he lost his footing. The elephant reached him. Richard Hale was trampled. Tendai continued firing at close range until a final shot found the angle it needed, and the animal collapsed. Richard Hale died at the scene. The shot had been close. In almost any other context, a shot landing within centimeters of its intended target achieves its purpose. But the frontal brain shot on a charging elephant at 25 meters with dust in the air and the visual reference moving is not a situation in which almost is sufficient. The deflection was not bad luck. It was physics. And the 2 to 3 seconds between the committed charge and contact were not enough time to recover, cycle a second round, and place a second shot before the distance closed to 0. Tendai had done everything a professional hunter could do. He had read the animal's agitation correctly. He had advised repositioning. He had fired immediately when the first shot failed. He had continued firing until the animal was down. None of it changed the outcome for Richard Hale, because the outcome had been determined in the fraction of a second when the shot landed centimeters from where it needed to land, and the elephant, which had been given every reason to stop, did not stop. The mixed woodland of Matabele Land North was quiet again by the time the situation was fully resolved. The heat continued to build. The dust settled back onto the ground. The bush returned to the particular stillness of a January afternoon, indifferent to what it had witnessed and unchanged by it. It was November 19th, 2014. Late afternoon light stretched across the frozen tundra southeast of Churchill, an open, snow-covered landscape along the coast where the terrain offered no natural barriers. Jory Flett, 22, had grown up in the nearby community, known for his reckless snowmobile riding and frequent off-trail trips. He worked part-time at a local airport and garage, saving for a high-powered snowmobile that he rode fast across unmarked terrain. During peak polar bear season, authorities warned residents to stay on designated trails, but Jory chose a shortcut across open tundra, confident his speed and experience would keep him safe. I keep thinking how overconfidence can take over, especially in a place where even one miscalculation can turn deadly. Polar bears in the area during this time are especially irritable. Adult females, typically weighing 400 to 700 pounds, are capable of fatal force in seconds if startled or provoked. Many were resting or moving across the tundra during their fasting period, making any unexpected human intrusion extremely dangerous. Reading this, I feel a grim sense of inevitability. The situation was inherently high risk, and even a minor accident could trigger a deadly encounter. As Jory approached a frozen creek bed lined with snow-covered willow scrub, traveling at roughly 45 miles per hour, his snowmobile struck the lip of the depression, lifting briefly before landing harshly. The right ski caught a hidden rock, flipping the machine and throwing him 12 feet into the deep snow of the far bank. Dazed and with a likely dislocated right shoulder, he tried to recover and assess the damage when a lone adult female polar bear emerged from a shallow daybed she had dug for shelter. Weighing approximately 500 to 600 pounds, she had been resting quietly until the sudden crash startled her. Her flattened ears and huffing showed clear agitation. I can't imagine the shock of seeing such a massive animal appear from nowhere and realizing your only cover is a small snowbank. Trapped in the creek bed with a 4-foot wall behind him, Jory attempted to retreat but slipped to one knee. The bear charged over a short distance, slamming into his chest and driving him backward into the bank with enough force to crack his sternum and compress his lungs. She pinned him with her left forepaw, claws puncturing through his jacket into the flesh beneath, while clamping her jaws onto his already injured right shoulder. The joint dislocated, muscles tore, and he was incapacitated almost instantly. The bear shifted her attention to his neck and upper trapezius, puncturing the external jugular vein and causing immediate blood loss. Jory's attempts to fend her off were ineffective, and she shook him, widening the wound from below the left ear to the collarbone. After releasing him briefly, she swatted his face, breaking his nose and fracturing his left cheekbone. The attack was defensive. The bear sought only to remove an intruder, but the result was fatal. Jory lost consciousness within minutes. Watching the details makes me reflect on how quickly natural instincts can turn a normal landscape into a lethal environment. The suddenness of the attack left little opportunity for response or escape. I keep thinking about how quickly the situation escalated, from a routine ride to a fatal encounter in a matter of moments. Jory's friend became concerned when he failed to arrive at the cabin and couldn't be reached by phone. A search was initiated, first along established trails, then by air the following morning. Ground teams eventually located the overturned snowmobile, and Jory's body was discovered against the creek bank, frozen and surrounded by a wide bloodstain. I keep thinking about how close help really is in these remote areas, and how isolation amplifies risk. Authorities concluded that the bear had acted defensively and made no attempt to pursue humans afterward, ruling the death accidental. The coroner documented massive skull and facial trauma, compound fractures, punctured chest wounds with rib fractures, and catastrophic arterial hemorrhage. Investigators emphasized the role of poor judgment. Traveling off-trail at high speed through polar bear territory exposed Jory directly to danger. Media coverage was minimal, and family members destroyed the footage and sold the snowmobile to prevent further distress. This incident highlights the lethal combination of human recklessness and Arctic wildlife. I think it was largely preventable. Ignoring warnings and cutting across the tundra removed any margin for error, and even a minor mistake quickly escalated into a fatal outcome. From what I can see, authorities handled it appropriately given the circumstances, as the bear acted defensively and the response came after the fact. In my view, the responsibility falls mostly on the victim, not out of blame, but as a reflection of the decisions that led there. What stands out to me is how unforgiving the Arctic is. Experience alone isn't enough, and without caution and respect for predators, one mistake can become irreversible. It was September 14, 2014, and the humid air of Kerala's Western Ghats hung heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and decomposing vegetation, where the dense forest canopy filtered the afternoon light into dappled patterns on the jungle floor. The remote trekking trail wound through prime habitat for some of India's most dangerous reptiles, including the species responsible for thousands of deaths annually across the subcontinent. Ryan Venko was a 22-year-old backpacker from Vancouver, Canada, whose gap-year journey through Southeast Asia had been documented extensively on his travel blog. His posts consistently emphasized his willingness to take risks that other travelers avoided, and he had built a modest online following by photographing himself in increasingly dangerous situations. Friends who had traveled with Ryan described him as someone who treated local warnings as challenges rather than legitimate safety concerns. Ryan had hired a local guide for the 3-day trek through the Periyar Wildlife Sanctuary, an experienced tracker named Ravi who knew the forest, its wildlife, and exactly how dangerous both could be. Ryan had made it clear from the outset that he wasn't interested in what he called tourist-friendly experiences. Ravi had warned him specifically about the high concentration of venomous snakes that became active during the monsoon season. Ryan had nodded, and then, on the second day, wandered off alone anyway. He was following a game trail that led to a small clearing when he spotted a large snake coiled beneath a fallen log approximately 10 feet away. The snake's distinctive hood and striking black and yellow banding immediately identified it as a king cobra, one of the world's most dangerous venomous species. Ryan identified it as a content opportunity, rather than backing away slowly, as Ravi would have advised had Ryan not left Ravi behind. Ryan approached the snake with his camera, planning to capture close-up shots of what he appears to have assumed was a docile, sun-basking reptile. King cobras are the world's longest venomous snakes, capable of reaching lengths exceeding 18 feet and weighing up to 20 pounds. They can deliver large volumes of neurotoxic venom capable of killing a human without treatment, with severe cases leading to respiratory failure within 1 to several hours without ventilatory support. Ryan had approached to within 6 feet of the coiled snake when it began displaying defensive behavior. The cobra raised its head and spread its distinctive hood, a warning signal recognizable to anyone with even passing familiarity with cobras, which Ryan did not appear to have. The snake's forked tongue flicked rapidly as it assessed the threat. Instead of retreating, Ryan continued moving closer, holding his camera at arm's length to capture what he believed would be an award-winning wildlife photograph. When he extended his free hand toward the snake, apparently intending to touch its hood, the cobra struck. The snake's fangs penetrated Ryan's right hand just below his knuckles, injecting a large volume of neurotoxic venom into the tissue of his hand. The bite lasted a fraction of a second. Ryan jerked his hand back, staring at the 2 small puncture wounds already beginning to swell and discolor. The cobra struck a second time as he stumbled backward, catching his forearm before withdrawing beneath the log. The snake had done what it needed to do and returned to its log. Ryan turned and ran blindly through the forest. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms of envenomation. His vision blurred, his speech slurred. Muscle weakness spread through his limbs as the neurotoxin began its work, making it increasingly difficult to stay upright as he crashed through undergrowth, searching for the guide he had deliberately left behind. Ryan collapsed approximately 200 yards from the bite site as his respiratory system began to shut down. He managed to activate the emergency beacon on his GPS device before losing consciousness. Piece of technology he had apparently packed alongside his camera, but not his judgment. Ravi found Ryan's body 3 hours later, guided by the GPS signal. A helicopter evacuation was attempted, but Ryan was pronounced dead before reaching medical facilities. The cause of death was respiratory failure, secondary to king cobra envenomation. The remote location made survival impossible, even with immediate intervention, which Ryan had ensured would not be available by separating from his guide in a forest he did not know, to photograph a snake he did not understand, for a blog that had a modest following. It was the evening of October 3rd, 2016, in a private conservancy bordering the Masai Mara in Kenya, where the sky had turned deep orange and the savanna grass caught the last light of the day. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the bush shifted. Animals that had rested through the afternoon heat began to move. The conservancy was the kind of place that looked, from a distance, like a postcard. Golden light, open plains, the silhouette of acacia trees against a fading sky. Madison Blake, 22, was an American Instagram model from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her account had grown steadily on the back of luxury travel content, carefully staged photographs in remote locations that made the wild look effortless and safe. She had roughly 31,000 followers and was building toward brand partnerships. Her content relied on proximity, not just beautiful landscapes, but herself inside them, close enough to make the image feel real. She had no formal wildlife training and had never been on a safari before this trip. Everything she knew about African wildlife came from what she had seen online. The version of Africa that exists on social media is curated, compressed, and stripped of consequence. It shows the golden hour and the elephant at sunrise. It does not show what moves through the grass after dark, or what happens when someone treats a wild landscape the same way they would treat a photo set. The first 2 days passed without incident. Madison photographed from the vehicle, but the results frustrated her. The animals were too far, the light too flat, the images too ordinary. By the second evening, she had begun pushing the guide, a local operator named Festus Ochieng, 46, to position the vehicle closer than standard practice allowed. Festus held firm on the core rules. No one exits the vehicle after dusk, no exceptions. I've seen this pattern before in my research, where someone with no real field experience starts treating a guide's instructions as suggestions rather than rules, and it almost always ends badly. What is worth understanding about Festus is that he was not being rigid for the sake of it. He had worked that conservancy for years. He knew what moved through the grass at dusk, and he knew that the rules he was enforcing were not arbitrary. They were written in the outcomes of situations exactly like this one. On the evening of October 3rd, the group stopped at an elevated ridge to watch the sunset. Madison wanted to frame herself against the horizon, standing outside the vehicle with the plains behind her. Festus refused. She waited until his attention shifted to another guest, then quietly stepped out, moving roughly 65 to 100 feet from the vehicle to find her angle. That distance sounds small on open ground, at dusk, separated from the vehicle by a stretch of grass that anything could be moving through. It is not small at all. What she did not know was that a clan of spotted hyenas had been active in the area since late afternoon. A fresh kill had been reported near a watering hole less than a mile from the ridge earlier that day. Spotted hyenas are not the passive scavengers most people picture. They are highly efficient hunters, capable of sustaining speeds near 37 miles per hour over distance, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush bone entirely. They are most active at dusk and dawn, and they are acutely sensitive to isolated movement on open ground. What I find particularly important to understand about hyenas is that a healthy, upright adult human near a vehicle is not a target they typically pursue, but a lone figure at distance, separated from any large object, moving unpredictably in fading light, is a completely different calculation for them. The vehicle matters. The group matters. The moment Madison stepped away from both, she changed what she looked like to everything watching from the grass. Madison was focused on her phone, adjusting her position against the fading light. She did not immediately notice the first animal emerge from the grass, roughly 80 feet to her left. It stopped and watched. Then a second appeared, further to her right, also stationary. Their low whooping calls carried across the ridge. Festus heard them from the vehicle and immediately looked toward Madison. He called out. She did not hear him or did not register the urgency in his voice. She saw the animals and froze. Then she turned and ran. This is the part that I think about every time I look at this case. Spotted. Hyenas have a well-documented chase response. A fleeing target triggers pursuit instinct in a way that a stationary one simply does not. Running was the worst possible reaction, and it sealed the outcome almost instantly. The nearest animal closed the distance within seconds, bit into her left calf, and pulled her down. It released and backed off briefly, still testing, but she was no longer upright, and that changed the dynamic entirely. A standing human registers differently than a human on the ground. Once she was down, the calculation shifted again. Festus was already driving toward her, horn blaring. The second animal moved in from the right. By the time the vehicle reached her position, Madison had sustained bites to her lower legs and one hand. Festus fired a warning shot, and the animals retreated into the grass. He got her into the vehicle and drove toward the Conservancy's airstrip. Madison remained conscious for the first several minutes, then went quiet from blood, loss, and shock. The wounds to her lower legs were severe. The femoral region of her left leg had been compromised, and bleeding could not be controlled in the field. She lost consciousness before the airstrip was reached. A medical team was waiting, but could not stabilize her. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the attack. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Festus was cleared of negligence. The hyenas were not destroyed. The Conservancy issued updated safety guidelines reinforcing the prohibition on exiting vehicles after 5 p.m. Madison's body was returned to Arizona. Her social media accounts remained active for several weeks before her family quietly archived them. The final post, uploaded the morning of October 3rd, showed the Kenyan plains at sunrise with a caption about chasing golden hour. She had been chasing it that evening too. She just did not understand what else was out there, chasing alongside her. The hyenas did not pursue her because she was there. They pursued her because she ran. That distinction is the part that is hardest to sit with. It was July 2017 at an unfenced bush camp in South Luangwa National Park, Zambia. The camp sat inside one of Africa's most active wildlife corridors, where animals moved freely through the grounds at night without barrier or restriction. Guests were told on arrival that tent zips had to be fully closed at all times. There were no exceptions to that rule. In the nights leading up to the incident, leopard activity had been recorded moving through the camp. Tom Bassett was 58, a retired postal worker who had saved for 3 years to make the trip possible. Irene Bassett was 55 and had planned every detail of it herself. The holiday was their 30th wedding anniversary and the first major trip they had taken together since their honeymoon. It had taken years of putting money aside, and it meant a great deal to both of them. 3 years of saving, 30 years of marriage, the first big trip since their honeymoon. I want you to hold that while you read what comes next. Tom attempted to fully close the tent zip before they settled in for the night. The zip kept catching on the inner lining and would not sit flush. After several attempts, he was still unable to get it to close cleanly. Irene told him to leave it. The opening was slight, she said, and the camp was lit, and other tents were nearby. It was not worth continuing to fight with it. Tom stopped trying. The tent was left slightly open along the zip seam where the closure had not sealed properly. They had returned to the tent earlier that evening with items from dinner, some of which introduced unfamiliar scent into the tent. I do not think Irene made a careless decision. I think she made a tired decision at the end of a long evening on a trip they had waited years for. Leopards are among the most capable and silent movers of any large predator. They are opportunistic and highly observant, and they investigate unfamiliar scents, movement, and accessible openings. They do not break through intact structures, but they will exploit and widen unsecured or weakened points of entry. The seam had not been fully closed. The fabric sat loose along the zip, leaving a visible point of access. From inside the tent, there had been small movements, shifting fabric, breathing, the kind of subtle disturbance that carries in still night air. The scent from inside the tent had been present since earlier that evening. The leopard approached and tested the opening at the seam, pushing against the loose fabric. The material shifted under pressure. The opening widened as the animal worked at it, enough for it to begin entering through the gap. The entry was not silent. There was movement in the fabric and a brief rasp of the zip under tension, enough disturbance to wake Tom, who was sleeping closest to the entrance. Tom woke to the movement at the zip and reacted toward it in the dark. The leopard was already entering, its head and shoulders pushing through the widened opening. The distance closed immediately. There was no space to retreat, and nothing between him and the animal. The contact was immediate and focused on the head and neck. What followed was brief. The leopard seized Tom by the upper body and pulled. He was dragged partially through the widened zip seam, his legs still inside the tent. Irene woke to the sound and reached for him in the dark. She took hold of his arm and pulled back. In doing so, she came within range of the animal. The leopard struck at her once before releasing Tom and withdrawing into the darkness outside. Irene was left with deep lacerations to her left forearm and hand. Tom Bassett died at the tent entrance. The cause of death was recorded as catastrophic trauma to the head and neck, consistent with a large predator attack. Irene was airlifted to a hospital in Lusaka, where she underwent surgery for her injuries. She survived. The sounds from inside the tent were heard by at least one guest in a neighboring tent, who described them as brief and then suddenly silent. Nobody understood what they had heard until morning. When the guide arrived at the tent at dawn for the morning check, he found Tom collapsed at the entrance, partially outside the tent. He called out, and Irene responded faintly from inside. The guide had 14 years of experience working in South Luangwa. He took leave immediately after that morning and did not return to the camp. Post-incident findings confirmed that the leopard had entered through the unsecured section of the zip seam and that the opening had widened under pressure from the animal. The point of entry was consistent with the partially open closure. Camp management reviewed the briefing protocols and reinforced the tent closure rule across all guest communications. The death was classified as a fatal wildlife intrusion resulting from an unsecured tent in an active leopard corridor. Irene Bassett returned to the United Kingdom 6 weeks after discharge. She had planned every detail of that trip herself. She came home alone. It was September 23, 2017, and the narrow strip of overgrown land along a drainage canal on the outskirts of Davao region was quiet, humid, and crawling with hidden dangers. Tall grass and dense shrubs had grown unchecked, and the area was known for occasional sightings of large snakes. Elian Vargo, 19, was searching for his missing dog, Bruno. He was the responsible one in his family, working part-time at a local electronics shop while helping care for his elderly grandmother. Bruno had been wandering near the canal since morning, and Elian didn't want to wait until dark. I can picture him moving through the grass, calling out for his dog, thinking it'll be a routine search. That area isn't as safe as it looks. The vegetation was thick and uneven, with hidden roots and holes making every step uncertain. Local warnings about large snakes had been ignored, and signs of recent movement in the grass were easy to miss. Even from the edge, it would have been difficult to spot anything lying still beneath the cover. Elian pushed forward, calling Bruno's name, unaware of the reticulated python coiled under the grass just a few feet away. Around 15 feet long, it struck instantly, biting his left thigh as it attempted to coil around his lower body in uneven partial wraps. He fell backward into the dense vegetation as the python tightened. The grass and branches scratched his arms and face, but the crushing pressure around his torso stole his focus. Every struggle only gave the snake more leverage. The coils shifted and tightened, restricting his movement further rather than forming a stable lock. The uneven ground made footing impossible, and every stumble let the coils squeeze harder. His chest felt trapped in a vice. His legs burned as circulation slowed, and each shallow gasp reminded him that fighting back only worsened the grip. I can't imagine that panic. Knowing every move just makes it worse, knowing there's nothing you can do. Within minutes, Elian couldn't breathe properly. His chest was compressed, lungs unable to expand, and the coils on his legs cut off circulation. Each attempt to call for help produced only weak gasps. I would have been panicking so hard at this point, trying to shout, trying to move, feeling the air get pulled out of my lungs. The struggle was chaotic and uneven, with the python adjusting its coils as he fought to break free. His breathing became increasingly restricted, and his movements weakened over time. After several minutes of mounting pressure, he lost consciousness. It's terrifying to think about the time stretching out like that, helpless, with something so strong around you. By nightfall, when Elian didn't return, his family searched with flashlights. His uncle found him about 2 hours after the attack, still partially entangled in the vegetation where the attack happened. Emergency services arrived 25 minutes later, but the snake had already retreated. I can't imagine the shock of seeing him like that, knowing it was too late. The coroner confirmed rib fractures from severe constriction and asphyxiation, consistent with a reticulated python attack. He was believed to have lost consciousness from prolonged compression and later died from respiratory failure caused by the injuries. Bruno's remains were found nearby days later, suggesting he may have been the first victim. It's heartbreaking to realize the dog led him right into danger without anyone noticing. After the incident, local officials posted additional warnings and increased patrols, but little else changed. Elian's family moved away within 6 months, unable to face the memories. Looking back, I feel like this could have been avoided. He didn't know he was in real danger. The area seemed quiet, familiar, but one wrong step in the wrong place, and it became fatal. I don't blame him. He just had no idea what was waiting there. It was March 2018. The frozen coastline of the Chukchi Sea stretched endlessly from the settlement of Rurkapi, Siberia, a vast expanse of fractured ice floes separated by dark open water, where drifting platforms and hidden gaps could turn a simple walk into a deadly misstep. Lyosha Tegrinin, 19, had grown up in this isolated community of 600, a quiet and curious young man who often wandered the coast alone, seeking solace and fascination in the stark Arctic landscape. He worked with his father repairing small engines, filling the monotony of settlement life with small tasks and coastal explorations, far removed from the distractions of social media or urban amusements. A small research hut near the shore, used by a local wildlife project, contained camera equipment, storage boxes, and a bucket of rendered seal fat that had been left unsecured, its pungent odor drifting across the ice and attracting wildlife. To Lyosha, the hut represented curiosity, a mysterious object he had observed from a distance for months, and it's easy to understand why he approached it. Growing up in a land where polar bears are ever present can make the extraordinary feel familiar, even safe. Polar bears are the Arctic's apex predators. Adult males weigh between 800 and 1,200 pounds, capable of crushing a seal's skull with a single bite, and their keen sense of smell allows them to detect food, or humans, across miles of frozen terrain. During March, most bears hunt seals on the sea ice, but some linger near settlements, drawn to scavenging opportunities and human food waste, making encounters a constant risk. From my perspective, this combination of human curiosity and environmental oversight, an unlocked hut with highly attractive bait, is a recipe for disaster, a reminder that even familiar surroundings can conceal lethal danger. Lyosha entered the hut, examining the equipment and storage boxes, unaware that a massive adult male polar bear had followed the scent of the seal fat and was approaching from downwind. The bear pushed against the unsecured door and entered, filling the cramped 8x8 foot space. Lyosha tried to retreat, but the predator lunged, seizing his left arm with enough force to crush the humerus and fragment the bone through muscle and skin. Desperately, he grabbed the doorframe with his right hand, but the bear's strength tore his fingers free, dragging him outside onto the snow. Once outside, the bear's jaws clamped onto Lyosha's torso with crushing force, driving him into the snow. His breathing broke into strained, uneven gasps as the impact and pressure overwhelmed him. The predator shook him violently, tearing into muscle and causing severe internal injuries. It then bit deeper into his abdomen, the damage quickly becoming unsurvivable. His movements weakened within moments as it continued. The entire sequence unfolded rapidly, leaving no realistic chance for escape. The bear fed briefly before dragging the body out of frame, leaving the hut and surrounding ice marked only by the aftermath of a young life cut short. It's chilling to realize how a moment of innocent curiosity can become instantly fatal when humans underestimate the power and instincts of Arctic wildlife. Meanwhile, Lyosha's father and 2 neighbors, alerted by his absence, rushed to the hut. They fired warning shots, driving the bear away, but it was too late. Lyosha was dead. The bear was tracked and removed 2 days later, while the hut and its equipment were dismantled. Lyosha's death received limited regional coverage, and his father quietly returned to work, carrying the weight of the loss in a community intimately familiar with the Arctic's unforgiving hazards. This incident highlights the lethal intersection of human curiosity, environmental hazards, and apex predators. From my perspective, it feels like a preventable tragedy. The unsecured hut and scented bait were obvious hazards, and entering alone removed every margin for survival. Authorities acted promptly once alerted, but once the encounter began, there was little they could do. It's sobering to realize that in environments like this, even minor lapses in judgment, approaching an unattended structure, or underestimating the presence of wildlife can have immediate, irreversible consequences. What lingers for me is the mental state Lyosha must have experienced, a mix of curiosity, fascination, and misjudged confidence, unaware that even a familiar Arctic landscape could turn deadly in seconds. The unsecured bait and structure highlight how human decisions can directly contribute to tragedy, and while authorities followed standard protocol afterward, the incident underscores that nature in the high Arctic does not forgive mistakes. Experience doesn't replace caution, and in places like this, even one wrong decision is enough. Lyosha's story is both a cautionary tale and a stark reminder of the unforgiving realities of survival, responsibility, and respect for wildlife in one of the world's harshest environments. It was the 14th of August, 2018. Serengeti National Park, northern Tanzania, open savanna stretching flat in every direction, tall grass breaking the sightlines in patches across the plain. A guided walking safari with 6 participants. The guide had found fresh lion tracks that morning before the group set out. The walk had been shortened as a result, and the briefing before departure had been direct. Stay tight, stay quiet. Do not move ahead of the guide under any circumstances. Kevin Marsh was 34. He worked as a personal trainer in Birmingham and carried himself the way physically confident people sometimes do, like the rules of an environment were suggestions until proven otherwise. He had come to Tanzania with 5 friends for his birthday. The trip was 3 days in when the incident happened. On the first day, he had left the trail twice and interacted with wildlife on one occasion. The guide had corrected him both times. Kevin had acknowledged it and continued in much the same way. Fresh lion tracks that morning, a shortened route, a direct briefing, 2 corrections from the guide in the previous 2 days. I am not sure what signal Kevin was waiting for, but whatever it was, the Serengeti had already given him several. The group set out on the morning of day 3 in close formation. The guide led. The group stayed behind him. The grass on either side was tall enough to limit visibility beyond a few meters in places. Kevin walked in formation for the first stretch and then gradually became restless. He spoke quietly to the friend beside him. He had heard somewhere that lions did not typically go for groups, that the size and noise of a cluster of people was enough of a deterrent to make an attack unlikely. He applied that logic to himself and decided the risk was low. He drifted forward, separating from the group by roughly 20 to 25 meters, moving ahead of the guide into open ground. He was no longer part of the group. He was an individual moving alone through predator territory, with lions confirmed in the area and likely moving through the grass nearby. He did not know how close. He was looking out at the plain with his back to the guide when the guide caught a brief movement in the grass. Low and directional, not consistent with wind. The guide shouted. Kevin turned toward the voice. He did not locate the threat before the lion broke from the grass. The charge covered the remaining ground in seconds. A lion in full charge across short distance does not leave time for a warning shot to function as a deterrent. The guide fired. The charge was already fully committed. The lion hit him from behind and took him to the ground. It seized the back of his neck and drove him down, maintaining the hold. He did not get up. The rest of the group was pulled back immediately. The guide moved toward Kevin as fast as it was safe to do so. Emergency services were contacted, and the park's emergency response was activated. Kevin Marsh was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 34 years old. The cause of death was traumatic injuries sustained during the lion attack. His friend brought his body home. He was buried in Birmingham. Post-incident findings confirmed that Kevin had separated from the group against direct instruction given that morning in response to confirmed lion activity in the area. No fault was identified with the guide or the operation. He had come to Tanzania with 5 friends for his birthday. Those friends brought him home. I do not know how you explain that flight back. 14. The Gulf of Mexico sat flat and hazy under a late summer sky. The heat had been building since early morning, pressing down on the water's surface in a way that made the horizon shimmer and blur. By midday, the conditions offshore were typical for the season. Warm water, low visibility beneath the surface, a faint current moving through the area without enough force to clear the suspended particulate that reduced underwater sightlines to a matter of feet. From above, the water looked calm and empty. Leonard Brooks was 41 years old, an experienced spearfisher who had been working the area for several hours. Over the course of the session, he had secured multiple fish to his body as he worked, a standard and practical approach to spearfishing that allows a diver to retain their catch without returning to the surface repeatedly. It is a common practice. It is also one that transforms the diver into a continuous and concentrated source of biological material dispersing into the surrounding water. Blood and fluid from the catch spread steadily outward into the current from his position. He had been in the water long enough for that trail to extend a significant distance in multiple directions. Leonard wasn't being reckless. He was doing exactly what experienced spearfishers do, but the water had been registering his presence for hours before anything happened. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous and least predictable shark species in the world. They are highly responsive to olfactory stimuli, capable of detecting extremely low concentrations of dissolved biological compounds in the water, and are known to range widely through both offshore and nearshore environments, including river systems and shallow coastal waters. They are not selective in the way that some shark species are. They are opportunistic, persistent, and highly reactive to the combination of scent and movement that a struggling or bleeding animal produces in the water. Unlike many shark species that make a single investigatory contact and withdraw to assess the result, bull sharks engage in escalating feeding behavior once sufficiently stimulated. When multiple individuals are present in the same area and the stimulus is strong and sustained, that escalation can become rapid, a compounding response driven by increased chemical and movement cues in the water, drawing more animals in and accelerating the pace of the response. Once that chain reaction starts with bull sharks, it doesn't slow down. The first bite wasn't the beginning of the danger. It was the end of any window to avoid it. The first contact came as a bite to the torso and arm, investigatory, a shark assessing an unfamiliar object, but the wound changed the situation immediately. Blood entered the water directly from Leonard's body, compounding an already substantial scent trail. His movement in response generated exactly the erratic motion that amplifies a feeding response. A second animal arrived within minutes, then another. The escalation built rather than ignited, but once it was building, nothing interrupted it. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the sharks, the building. As Leonard became incapacitated, his orientation shifted, his body rising toward the surface, his head exposed as control collapsed. The facial injuries weren't deliberate, they were incidental, the result of repeated close-range contact once he had no position left to hold. With bull sharks, the window doesn't just close, it disappears. It was August 9th, 2015. The Rufiji River basin in Tanzania was deep into the dry season. The river had dropped significantly from its wet season levels, exposing wide stretches of soft, unstable bank. The mud along the waterline compressed underfoot in a way that made footing unreliable. Water itself was opaque with suspended silt, its surface a flat, featureless brown that gave no indication of depth, current, or what might be moving beneath it. The dry season on the Rufiji is when the river's crocodile population becomes most concentrated and most dangerous. As water levels drop, the areas where prey animals can drink become fewer and more predictable, and the crocodiles that patrol those areas know it. The silt makes it impossible to see into the water, which means a crocodile lying in 2 feet of water 3 feet from the bank is as invisible as one lying in the middle of the channel. The surface gives nothing away. I can't imagine being that close and thinking you can see all the danger. Daniel Kruger was 51 years old, a German hunter with considerable experience in African game, who had come to the Rufiji specifically for crocodile during the late dry season, when conditions were considered as favorable as they get, partnering up with Juma Salim, a 45-year-old who had spent his entire working life on the Rufiji. He knew that the waterline during the dry season was not a place to stand. It was a place to observe from a distance. The distinction was the difference between being a person watching a crocodile and being a person in a crocodile's environment. The Nile crocodile is one of the most effective ambush predators on the planet. An adult male can exceed 16 feet and weigh over 1,000 pounds, capable of accelerating from complete stillness to full attack speed in a fraction of a second. It is an explosion from a stationary position, locating a target in completely opaque water with a precision that vision alone could not provide. The death roll uses the crocodile's body weight and the resistance of the water to tear rather than simply bite, and the instability of the target's footing to pull rather than simply hold. Daniel spotted a crocodile partially exposed near the bank. It was visible, positioned, and within range, but the angle was not ideal. To improve it, he stepped down onto the muddy slope and placed one foot at the waterline. The mud compressed and shifted under his weight. He lowered into a semi-kneeling position to stabilize himself. Juma warned him quietly to stay back. Daniel adjusted his footing again, shifting his weight slightly to find a more stable position. I can't see the reason here for stepping closer. The risk was already enormous. The adjustment sent a vibration through the waterlogged mud and into the water at the bank's edge. To a human being nearby, it would have been imperceptible. To a crocodile lying fully submerged within a few feet of the bank, it was precise and unambiguous information about the location and movement of something at the water's edge. The second crocodile had been there the entire time. It was lying fully submerged in the shallow water, invisible in the silted water, motionless in the way that crocodiles are motionless when waiting. Not the stillness of an animal at rest, but the stillness of an animal already committed to what it is about to do. Daniel had not seen it because it was not possible to see it. It was simply there, doing what Nile crocodiles do in the dry season along the Rufiji, and Daniel had placed himself within its range. It launched instantly. The crocodile clamped onto Daniel's leg and immediately initiated the death roll, using the torque of its body and the unstable footing of the muddy bank to pull him off balance. Daniel was on soft ground that could not support a braced resistance. The crocodile was in water that provided both leverage and mobility. Juma moved to intervene, but slipped on the same mud that had compromised Daniel's footing. Within seconds, Daniel was in the water. The transition from the bank to the deeper channel took very little time. The surface disturbance that marked the point of entry lasted only moments before going still. The Rufiji closed over the site of the attack and returned to its flat, featureless, opaque surface as if nothing had occurred. Partial remains were recovered downstream. The river had done what the river does. The crocodile Daniel had been watching from the bank was never the threat. It had drawn his attention and his decision to improve his angle. And while all of that was happening, the real threat had been lying in the water, 3 feet from where he placed his foot, waiting for the vibration that would tell it the time had come. It was October 3rd, 2017, and the pre-dawn darkness over Hudson Bay's western shore stretched across barren tundra. 7 kilometers from Arviat, a solitary plywood cabin stood against the endless landscape, its faint light visible in the remote, frozen expanse. Thomas Makichak, 21, had always been quiet and solitary, preferring time alone to the constant social awareness that life in Arviat demanded. He worked seasonal odd jobs and helped his uncle with caribou, hunting each fall. But after his girlfriend left for college 3 weeks earlier, he had retreated to this remote cabin to clear his head. I find it easy to empathize with him, wanting a quiet place to think. But in October, in that region, solitude comes with extreme risks. His uncle had given him a warning about bears coming inland at this time and the dangers of leaving food outside, advice Thomas didn't fully heed. Thomas arrived with basic supplies: canned food, a sleeping bag, a battery-powered radio, and fishing gear. He spent 2 days fishing for Arctic char and cooking them inside the cabin, thinking he had stored waste properly. But on the evening of October 2nd, he cleaned 2 fish outside and left the heads, guts, and skin in a plastic bag near the front steps. I can't stress enough how dangerous that decision was. Leaving any food outside in polar bear country is like putting a target on your door. The Hudson Bay region is home to some of the world's southernmost polar bears, with adult males weighing 900 to 1,200 pounds and capable of detecting scents from miles away. I've always been struck by how intelligent and persistent these animals are. They are apex predators with few natural fears, especially of humans. Around 5:15 a.m., Thomas was awakened by scraping and sniffing sounds outside. Through the cabin's small window, he saw a massive adult male polar bear consuming the fish scraps less than 8 feet away. My heart immediately tightened. Reading this, I can practically feel that moment of sheer terror. The bear's attention escalated, testing the door latch and pushing against the structure with its enormous weight. I think about how helpless anyone would feel inside a fragile plywood cabin facing a predator of that size. In a fatal misjudgment, Thomas tried to scare the bear by banging a metal pot and shouting. The polar bear, undeterred by noise, began ramming the door with repeated, heavy impacts. The plywood frame shuddered under the blows, nails loosening and hinges straining before the structure finally splintered, giving way after several sustained strikes. The predator lunged, clamping onto his right forearm with crushing force, fracturing bone and dragging him off balance. Thomas tried to pull away, twisting and stumbling as the bear forced him down. The animal released and immediately readjusted, snapping upward toward his head and tearing into his face. Blood began filling his airway as the bear shook him violently, the force of the motion causing rapid, catastrophic damage. Within seconds, the initial attack had knocked him into a losing position, and over the next moments, the confined cabin descended into sustained, uncontrolled violence. The attack continued in bursts. The bear bit into his chest, cracking ribs before pausing to reposition its grip. It then dragged him through the broken doorway onto the frozen ground, where it clamped down again on his leg, tearing deep into the tissue as blood spread rapidly across the snow. I feel sick just imagining the sheer violence and scale of the injuries. There was almost no chance for survival once the bear committed. Concerned when Thomas didn't respond to radio calls, his uncle Paulucci approached the cabin with a rifle. He fired warning shots, driving the bear away, and confirmed Thomas's death. Wildlife officers arrived later and documented the scene. I have to admit, while the response was as fast as could be expected in such a remote location, the outcome was already inevitable. The coroner's report listed massive skull and facial trauma, compound fractures, punctured chest wounds, and severe arterial hemorrhage. The death was classified as a wildlife fatality with victim contribution due to improper food storage. Access to the cabin and surrounding areas was later restricted, and Paulucci dismantled the structure the following spring. Thomas's solitude and desire for escape were understandable, but in this environment, he bore full responsibility for his safety. The incident underscores the harsh reality that even small lapses in judgment, leaving food outside or lacking deterrence, can be instantly fatal in the Arctic. Reading this, I keep asking myself if authorities could have done more. Realistically, in such a remote area, there's only so much they can intervene before the fact. I personally think this was entirely preventable if Thomas had respected bear safety protocols, properly stored all food, and carried a deterrent. In my view, the responsibility rests squarely on him, not out of blame, but as a stark reminder of how unforgiving the wilderness can be. It was July 15, 2016, along a rural highway in Trang Province, Thailand. Traffic had slowed under the afternoon heat because a large king cobra was stretched across the road. Niran Pechkul, 34, was known around nearby areas as someone who could deal with snakes. He worked as a motorcycle mechanic, but on the side, he helped remove snakes from homes and small properties. He didn't have formal training, but he had done it enough times that he trusted himself. Small bites and close calls didn't scare him anymore. They just became stories he told. To me, it feels like this is where things start to go wrong. When you've done something enough times that you stop thinking about what could actually happen. That afternoon, Niran was riding home when he saw the traffic. He moved between the stopped vehicles and saw the cobra lying across both lanes. It was large, thick, and already watching everything around it. Some people had stepped out of their cars. A few were filming. Others just stood there, unsure what to do. I've seen situations like this before. Once people stop and gather, it usually makes things worse. The snake had its head raised slightly, hood partly open, following movement. A truck driver nearby warned people to stay back. A few others agreed and said it was better to wait, but Niran stepped forward and said he could move it. Honestly, this feels like one of those moments where everything depends on a single choice, whether you step in or just leave it alone. He walked behind the snake, planning to grab it the way he had seen in videos. But as he got closer, the cobra turned toward him, its head lifted higher, body tensing. Watching videos makes it look easy. Real life isn't like that. Niran moved quickly and tried to grab the head, but his hand landed too far back. The cobra reacted instantly. It twisted and struck. The first bite hit his left forearm as he raised it. Niran pulled back immediately and lost his grip. The cobra recoiled, hood flared wide, holding its ground. As he stumbled backward, his movement brought him close again. The snake struck a second time in quick succession, a defensive reaction rather than a pursuit. From what I know, once something goes wrong with a snake like this, the situation escalates fast. He managed to move a few steps, but something was already off. At first it was subtle. He looked unsteady. His movements slowed. When he tried to speak, his words didn't come out clearly. Then his breathing began to change, becoming shallow and strained. People around him didn't know what to do. Some shouted, others moved away. One person called for help. I don't think people freeze because they don't care. They just don't know how to react in a situation like this. Niran collapsed near the side of the road. The cobra lowered itself and moved away into the nearby vegetation. On the ground, his condition continued to deteriorate. He remained conscious for a short time, but he couldn't respond properly. His breathing grew weaker, each breath more labored than the last. Within around 15 minutes of the bite, it had become critically shallow. Emergency services arrived shortly after, finding him barely responsive and showing signs of severe neurotoxic envenomation. He was placed in an ambulance, but his condition deteriorated during transport. His breathing grew increasingly irregular as paralysis spread, and despite efforts to support his airway, he went into respiratory failure. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. Arrival, approximately 40 minutes after the initial bite. The incident didn't get much attention. It was reported simply as a snake handling accident. People who knew him remembered him as someone who helped others, but also someone who got too comfortable doing something dangerous. I think that's what makes this hard. He wasn't trying to do something reckless. He just believed he could handle it. For me, this feels preventable. He didn't have to step in. People were already waiting, and help could have been called. I don't think he meant to take a big risk, but he still chose to. With something like a king cobra, there's almost no room for mistakes. Sometimes the safer move is just to leave it alone, even if you think you can handle it. It was April 22nd, 2017, and the oppressive heat of the Australian wet season hung over the remote waterways of the Northern Territory, where the muddy brown water moved slowly between mangrove-lined banks that concealed one of nature's most patient predators. Warning signs in multiple languages dotted the shoreline, their sun-faded text describing recent crocodile attacks and the futility of swimming in these waters. Ben Crawford was a 30-year-old personal trainer from Sydney whose social media presence was built around extreme fitness challenges and death-defying stunts. His YouTube channel had gained a modest following through videos of him performing dangerous workouts in precarious locations, a brand identity that required him to continuously escalate. Friends described him as someone who dismissed safety advice as cowardice, disguised as wisdom, which is a very specific worldview to hold when you are planning to swim in a river full of large reptiles. Ben had driven 12 hours from Darwin specifically to film content at this remote river system, drawn by online reports of large crocodile populations and the area's reputation as one of Australia's most dangerous waterways. He had researched the location obsessively, not for safety information, but for the most dramatic angles and the highest likelihood of crocodile encounters. He got exactly what he came for. Local Aboriginal guides at a nearby fishing camp had warned Ben about the river's reputation when he stopped for directions. They explained that the waterway was home to numerous saltwater crocodiles, including several large males responsible for multiple attacks on livestock and at least 2 human fatalities in recent years. Ben thanked them for the information, while privately dismissing their concerns as exaggerated local folklore designed to keep tourists away from prime fishing spots. The guides, who had lived alongside this river their entire lives, were presumably unaware of how much Ben knew about it after a few hours of online research. The riverbend Ben had selected was particularly notorious among locals. The deep pool was marked by slide marks on the muddy banks and the complete absence of water birds that typically populated similar areas. 2 details that, to anyone paying attention, communicated something important about the local food chain. Ben waded into the shallows, planning to swim across the 50-foot wide channel channel. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with mature males commonly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators of extraordinary patience, capable of remaining motionless for hours while monitoring potential prey. Their bite force is among the most powerful in the animal kingdom, measuring over 3,700 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush a water buffalo's skull. Ben had waded approximately 15 feet from shore when the water erupted around him. A saltwater crocodile, estimated at 14 to 16 feet in length, launched itself from the muddy bottom with explosive force. The animal's jaws, open to 75 degrees, clamped down on Ben's right leg, just above the knee. The initial bite fractured his femur, the crushing pressure collapsing bone and muscle beneath jaws designed to overpower large prey. The crocodile immediately initiated its death roll, spinning through the murky water with Ben trapped in its jaws. The violent rotation disoriented Ben completely, his world becoming a chaos of brown water, pain, and the crushing pressure around his leg. Each revolution tore muscle and ligament, the crocodile's teeth grinding against bone and tissue. Ben's attempts to surface for air were futile as the death roll continued, the crocodile's massive weight and momentum keeping him submerged. The spinning motion caused massive internal damage as his body was whipped through the water. Blood dispersed through the current in a way that could have drawn the attention of other crocodiles nearby. After what seemed like an eternity, but lasted perhaps 30 seconds, the crocodile released its grip and repositioned, clamping down on Ben's torso just below his ribcage. The second bite punctured his lung and crushed several ribs, the massive teeth penetrating deep into his chest cavity. Ben's scream was cut short as water filled his punctured lung, his body going into shock from blood loss and trauma. The crocodile began dragging Ben into deeper water. Crocodiles typically drown large prey before consuming it, often dragging carcasses into submerged areas where they may be cached. Ben's consciousness faded as his body was pulled beneath the surface, and the water gradually returned to its deceptively calm state. A search and rescue operation was launched when Ben failed to return to his accommodation that evening. His abandoned vehicle was found at the river access point. Ben's body was never recovered, despite extensive searching of the river system. The Northern Territory government used the incident to reinforce warnings about crocodile-infested waterways, though officials noted that Ben had ignored multiple posted warnings and had deliberately entered water known to be extremely dangerous. Additional signage was installed. It joined the signs that had already been there, which Ben had also ignored. His YouTube channel was deleted by his family shortly after his death. It was October 28, 2018, and the subarctic tundra near Churchill stretched toward ice-free waters. During the pre-ice season, nutritionally stressed polar bears gathered in the area, increasing the risk of human encounters. Strict safety protocols were in place, but their effectiveness depended on visitor compliance. Natalia Cooper, 39, arrived days earlier, carrying the bitterness of a life recently upended. A former office manager, she had lost her job due to absenteeism and confrontational behavior, leading to eviction and the humiliating need to move back in with her mother. The Budget Polar Bear Adventure Tour represented her attempt to prove she could still manage independence, though fellow travelers quickly grew weary of her constant complaints about tour rules. Her presence had already created conflicts with the lead guide Tommy, whose family had lived in the area for generations. Natalia dismissed safety briefings as unnecessary theatrics, interpreting genuine warnings about bear behavior as personal slights. Her confrontational attitude alienated other tourists. Churchill's location on the western shore of Hudson Bay creates a unique situation where polar bears concentrate in unprecedented numbers during the pre-ice season from October through November. Adult male polar bears can exceed 1,500 pounds and possess bite forces of 1,200 pounds per square inch. But their primary danger during the pre-ice period stems from nutritional stress that drives increasingly desperate predatory behavior. Tommy had emphasized repeatedly that late October represented the most dangerous period for human-bear encounters, when nutritionally stressed bears lose their natural wariness of humans and begin exhibiting predatory hunting behaviors. The town had implemented strict protocols requiring tourists to travel in groups and avoid dawn or dusk activities when bear movement peaked. The evening before her death, Natalia had announced her intention to take an early morning solo walk to photograph the aurora borealis, dismissing Tommy's urgent warnings about bear activity during pre-dawn hours. When Tommy and other tour members strongly discouraged this plan, Natalia exploded in fury, accusing everyone of controlling her and treating her like a stupid American who couldn't handle basic outdoor activities. Despite explicit instructions prohibiting solo travel outside the lodge, Natalia left through a rear exit without notifying the guides. She walked along the perimeter road to photograph the aurora borealis. During this time, a male polar bear in the area, experiencing nutritional stress during the pre-ice season, was moving systematically through the outskirts and detected her presence. A nutritionally stressed male polar bear had been moving systematically through the outskirts, following scents that drew him toward areas with human activity. Unlike the defensive attacks typical of brown bears, polar bear predation during this pre-ice season represents calculated hunting behavior. Unlike other bears, polar bears are true carnivores with no fear of humans. They actively hunt people as prey when hungry. During the pre-ice season, after months without food, a starving polar bear views a lone human not as a threat to avoid, but as a meal to pursue. The bear detected Natalia's movement behind a storage shed and approached with the silent precision of an Arctic apex predator. The bear made contact from behind, and Natalia lost her balance, tumbling onto the snow-covered ground. The predator's massive jaws and weight caused immediate and severe injuries to her neck, shoulders, and upper torso, including deep puncture wounds, lacerations, and extensive soft tissue trauma. The force of the attack also inflicted blunt force trauma to her ribs and internal organs, while major blood vessels were severed, leading to rapid blood loss. As she struggled to regain her footing, the bear's grip prevented movement. The combination of crushing force, sharp bites, and sustained pressure overwhelmed her body's ability to respond. Despite attempts to move or cry out, Natalia became immobilized by the combination of trauma, shock, and hemorrhage. The polar bear did not disengage. It maintained control of her body, repositioning and dragging her several feet across the snow toward partial cover near the shed. Feeding behavior began shortly after she ceased resisting. The attack was sustained and methodical, consistent with predatory intent. A local worker observed the bear and notified regional wildlife authorities. The authorities arrived with deterrent equipment and were able to drive the bear away from the area. The post-mortem revealed massive trauma to the spine and skull consistent with a large predator attack, including crushing injuries and extensive tissue damage. Death resulted from catastrophic cervical spine trauma and neurogenic shock, compounded by severe blood loss. Wildlife authorities classified Natalia's death as a predatory attack during the pre-ice season. Her mother managed arrangements privately. The bear was tracked and euthanized shortly after in accordance with regional wildlife management protocols, as polar bears that carry out confirmed predatory attacks are not considered safe candidates for relocation. It was August 12, 2018, and the small wildlife park outside Polokwane should have been a fun stop on Leora's trip, but that day it became a disaster waiting to happen. Thick concrete barriers and glass separated visitors from the snakes, and yet one wrong step would turn everything upside down. Leora Dane, 29, had built a modest following on her social media platform, always chasing the next daring shot. I can picture her scrolling through her feed earlier that morning, thinking she needed something epic for this post. She had a reputation among her friends for ignoring warnings and pushing limits, brushing off caution as unnecessary. That afternoon, the 15-foot king cobra appeared still behind the glass enclosure, and Leora thought she could handle it. I keep imagining her confidence, her arm stretching over the barrier, believing she was safe. Her friends egged her on, filming every move with their phones. They thought the glass and concrete were enough to keep her safe, but the snake didn't read the script. King cobras are large and fast, and even slight disturbance in close range can trigger a rapid defensive strike. It's the kind of thing you think you can control until reality hits. Then, there's no control at all. When Leora reached over the barrier, her hand moved just past the designated viewing boundary, briefly entering the snake's immediate strike range near the enclosure glass. The king cobra reacted instantly, lifting and driving its head forward in a rapid defensive strike and biting her forearm before she could fully retract her arm. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough for staff to immediately recognize what had happened and move in. Staff reacted within seconds, stepping in with controlled urgency to pull her back from the enclosure and secure the surrounding area so no one else could approach. The response was fast and coordinated, focused on separating her from any further risk while assessing her condition. I can't stop picturing how quickly she must have realized what had happened, the shock setting in almost immediately. Within minutes, she began showing early signs of neurotoxic envenomation, starting with slurred speech and a noticeable loss of control in her facial and throat muscles. Her breathing gradually became more labored, with short, shallow attempts to inhale becoming more frequent. She remained conscious but increasingly weak and was placed under close medical monitoring as responders initiated immediate treatment and prepared for possible respiratory support using rapid stabilization measures. Paramedics arrived shortly after and transported her to hospital while she was still conscious but weak and unstable. She was placed on ventilatory support as respiratory weakness progressed. Over the following hours, her breathing continued to deteriorate due to neurotoxic effects. And despite intensive resuscitation efforts, she later died in hospital from respiratory failure caused by king cobra envenomation. The park shut the exhibit for review, raising barriers and adding briefings. Leora's case was later used in internal safety reviews and public awareness materials about enclosure risk. Local news covered the incident moderately, highlighting how a brief lapse in judgment near a wildlife enclosure can lead to a serious medical emergency that develops rapidly after exposure. Honestly, it makes me think twice about even leaning over a railing near a wild animal. Looking back, I don't think Leora was reckless out of stupidity. She underestimated the danger, but it was completely preventable. The warnings were clear. The barriers were there for a reason, and even a brief moment of overconfidence was enough to put her in real danger. If I were there, I would have stayed back. Some animals are simply too strong and too fast to play with, no matter how brave you think you are. It was October 14, 2017. The Luangwa Valley in Zambia had been baking under a relentless late-season sun for weeks, and the morning of the 14th offered no relief. By mid-morning, the heat had already settled into the landscape like something permanent, pressing down through the Mopane canopy and turning the air thick and still. Visibility collapsed within a few dozen yards in any direction. I can't imagine how anyone could move through that terrain without feeling utterly exposed. It was the kind of environment that rewarded patience and punished assumptions. Peter Langford was 47 years old, an American hunter with nearly 2 decades pursuing dangerous game across multiple continents. He was not a man who frightened easily or second-guessed himself often. That combination had served him well, and had also, over time, built in him a particular resistance to being told to wait. Hunting with him was Moses Chanda, who was 39 years old and had spent his entire professional life in the Luangwa Valley. He had grown up near its edges, learned its animals before he learned to read, and built a career grounded in the kind of accumulated knowledge that only comes from years of direct exposure to a specific landscape. Moses understood Cape Buffalo the way a person understands a neighbor they have lived beside for decades, not with affection, but with a precise awareness of what that neighbor was capable of when provoked. He had developed a set of protocols that he did not bend, not because he was rigid, but because the animals had taught him repeatedly what happened when those protocols were ignored. I keep thinking about how many times his knowledge probably saved lives, and yet, on this day, it wasn't enough. The Cape buffalo is responsible for more hunter fatalities in Africa than any other dangerous game animal. And the reason is not simply its size or aggression. The reason is its intelligence. A wounded Cape buffalo does not behave like a wounded animal trying to escape. It circles. It doubles back. It uses cover deliberately. It positions itself along its own back trail and waits for the thing that is following it to walk past. And then it charges from behind, at close range, with no warning and no hesitation. Peter fired at approximately 60 yards. The shot landed high on the shoulder, producing a visible blood response, but no lung involvement. A lung shot on a Cape buffalo is a death sentence for the animal. A shoulder hit without lung involvement is something else entirely. Painful, damaging, and survivable. The buffalo crashed off through the brush at full speed, without any of the signs that indicate an animal about to go down. Moses read the situation immediately. The hit was non-lethal. The animal was mobile, aware, and almost certainly already beginning the process of deciding what to do about the thing that had just shot it. Moses called for a minimum 1-hour wait. This is standard protocol for wounded, dangerous game. A wounded animal that is allowed to lie down will stiffen, weaken, and lose the physical capacity to mount an effective defense. An animal that is pushed immediately is still operating at full adrenaline and now actively motivated to deal with the source of its injury. The 1 hour wait is not a courtesy. It is a survival strategy for the people doing the following. Peter waited approximately 20 minutes. The heat was rising steadily, and he was concerned about losing the blood trail as the ground dried and the blood darkened into the dust, becoming harder to distinguish from the surrounding soil. It was a legitimate concern, but it was also the kind of concern that felt rational in the moment and became a contributing factor in an incident report afterward. He pushed back. Peter moved forward anyway. "I just can't believe it." He had a clear warning and chose to ignore it. The initial blood sign thinned considerably within the first 200 yards. The tracks showed the buffalo slowing, then angling, no longer running straight, but beginning to move with more deliberation. It was not running blind anymore. It was moving with purpose, and the direction of that purpose was not away from them. The wind began to shift unpredictably as the temperature climbed. Unreliable wind is one of the most dangerous conditions a hunter can operate in when following wounded, dangerous game. Wind carries scent, and scent tells an animal exactly where you are, how far away you are, and which direction you are moving. The bush felt off. No immediate bird movement. Insect noise reduced in the space directly around them. Moses noticed it. He had noticed it before, and he knew what it sometimes meant. But the blood trail was still there, and the assumption, the reasonable, entirely understandable assumption, was that the buffalo was somewhere ahead of them. It was not ahead of them. The buffalo had circled downwind and doubled back. It had moved off the line of its original flight, swung wide through the dense cover, and repositioned itself along its own back trail in a patch of vegetation thick enough to conceal an animal of its size completely. This is documented behavior in wounded Cape buffalo. It is not rare. It is one of the primary reasons that professional hunters in the Luangwa Valley insist on the waiting period, with a consistency that can seem excessive to hunters who have not yet seen what happens when it is skipped. I can't believe the animal had the patience to wait like that, perfectly positioned. Peter and Moses had unknowingly moved past the point where the buffalo had slowed. They were now ahead of it, following a trail that was leading them further from the animal with every step. The cover around them was dense enough that the buffalo could have been within 20 yards and remained invisible. At under 15 yards, the buffalo charged from behind and slightly off angle. There was no warning sound. The first indication Peter had that the animal was behind him was the charge itself, already committed, already covering ground, at a speed that left almost no time for response. He turned late, catching only a partial view through brush. The rifle came up off balance, the angle wrong, and the time insufficient. He fired a rushed shot that missed completely. The buffalo hit low, lifting him off balance before the horn drove into his abdomen. The injuries were not survivable in the field, at that distance from any form of medical assistance. Moses pivoted and fired multiple close-range shots, killing the animal within seconds. He had done everything a professional guide could do. He had called the hit correctly. He had insisted on the wait. He had been overruled. None of it was enough to save Peter Langford, who died on site from internal hemorrhage before any assistance could reach them. It was July 28, 2018, and the Louisiana summer was doing what Louisiana summers do, pressing heat and humidity into every corner of the day. The air thick enough that even standing still felt like effort. By late afternoon outside Baton Rouge, the light had gone gold and heavy, and the surface of the water in Eric Landry's backyard enclosure sat completely still, reflecting nothing. Eric, 38, had built the enclosure himself over the course of about 2 years. A 20-foot long, 4-foot deep structure with a water section that took up roughly half the total space. He was a detail-oriented man by nature, the kind of person who documented his builds and took quiet pride in doing things properly. Louisiana has a long-established alligator, farming and handling industry, and private ownership of American alligators, while regulated, existed within a framework that experienced handlers could navigate. Eric had the permits. He had the paperwork. What he had built was, on paper, compliant. The animal he kept inside it was an American alligator, approximately 11 feet long and over 500 pounds. A species that has remained essentially unchanged for 37 million years because nothing about its design needed improving. I think about that sometimes. An animal that has outlasted almost everything else on this continent, and someone decided to keep one in their backyard in Baton Rouge. American alligators are ambush predators, and their entire anatomy is organized around that single strategy. Their eyes and nostrils sit at the very top of the skull, allowing them to remain almost entirely submerged while maintaining full sensory awareness of the surface above. They can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. In murky water, they are functionally invisible, and when they strike, the movement from stillness to full contact is among the fastest predatory actions in the animal kingdom. Studies have clocked the initial lunge at under 150 milliseconds. The bite force of a large adult exceeds 2,000 pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded for any living animal. What follows the bite is the death roll, a full-body rotation used to disorient prey and drag it below the surface. It is not a defensive behavior, it is a feeding behavior. The water in the enclosure had developed significant algae and sediment buildup over the preceding weeks, reducing visibility below the surface to near zero. Eric was aware of it. Cleaning was on his list, but on July 28th, he entered the enclosure for a late afternoon feeding before the water had been cleared, approaching the waterline carrying food, in conditions that were meaningfully different from the ones he'd grown accustomed to. No overhead barriers, no external feeding system, no protected approach path had been installed. The enclosure was well built, but the safety architecture around the feeding process had never been completed. Eric was at the water's edge when the alligator came up from below the surface with no visible warning. The bite was immediate, followed by the death roll, a full-body rotation that pulled him toward the deeper section of the enclosure. Disturbed water, mud displacement, and drag marks told the story of what followed. He had no barrier between himself and the water. In conditions where he couldn't see the animal had seen him perfectly. A nearby resident reported a sudden splash and a brief disturbance, then silence. Eric was reported missing later that evening. Authorities searched the enclosure and recovered remains from the water. The alligator was euthanized due to immediate risk. The case was later referenced in regional safety discussions, though it received limited public coverage. What stays with me about Eric's case is the water visibility. That single factor, sediment and algae obscuring the surface, transformed a dangerous situation into a fatal one. He couldn't see the animal. The animal could detect him perfectly. That asymmetry in a shared space with no barriers left no margin at all. It's the kind of detail that seems almost incidental until you understand what it actually meant. It was January 14th, 2014, and the cramped chicken coop on the outskirts of Kampong Cham felt smaller than ever, the low ceiling forcing anyone inside to crouch while moving. That night, a massive Burmese python had already made its way into space, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sokum Dara, 51, had spent decades building his small farm, raising chickens for both his family and extra income. He was a careful man, known for tending his birds meticulously. Lately, though, 6 chickens had gone missing, and Dara's frustration grew. He decided to stay overnight in the coop, hoping to catch the culprit. At first, Dara assumed the thief was a human. He imagined a neighbor or passerby sneaking in under cover of night to take his chickens, thinking about the footprints he might see or the shadows he might catch. I can picture him sitting there, crouched among the chickens, flashlight in hand, legs cramping, thinking he's ready for whatever comes, but not knowing what's really waiting. The coop was tiny, only 8 by 12 feet. Every corner was within reach, leaving little room to dodge anything large. Burmese pythons can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 160 pounds. Their strength is terrifying. They can crush ribs and stop blood flow in minutes. In confined spaces, they use every surface for leverage. Dara probably thought he was in control, but the space gave the snake the upper hand. I keep thinking about how claustrophobic that must have felt. Walls so close that every move became a risk. Earlier signs should have warned him. Villagers had talked about increased python activity after the seasonal flooding, and a neighbor had found a large shed skin nearby. Chickens were acting stressed, squawking at night, huddling unnaturally. I can almost hear that frantic clucking echoing in my head, like a warning he didn't fully understand. Around midnight, the chickens erupted into chaos. Dara's flashlight illuminated the massive python coiled around one of his hens. Startled, he lunged to save. The bird slipped on the damp floor and fell directly into the snake's striking range. The serpent uncoiled and struck, wrapping firm coils around Dara's torso while pinning his left arm. The python wasn't immediately crushing him, but each struggle only made it tighten further. I hate imagining the helplessness, trying to push it away, feeling it adjust and brace itself, realizing nothing you do loosens its grip. Every movement gave the snake more leverage. Its muscles worked like a machine, tightening around Dara's chest and abdomen, then looping around his legs. The cramped coop meant he couldn't twist or get proper footing. breathing became shallow, each gasp weak and muffled. I can feel the panic imagining it, pressure crushing your ribs, arms pinned, and the ground slippery beneath you. Within minutes, he lost consciousness as the pressure around his chest restricted breathing and circulation. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the unusual silence and discovered Dara's body still wrapped in the python's coils. Authorities arrived about 30 minutes later, finding the snake had moved to a corner but remained in the coop. The examination showed multiple rib fractures and internal injuries consistent with prolonged constriction and asphyxiation. He was later pronounced dead from complications of his injuries. The python was nearly 17 feet long and was later relocated by wildlife officials. After Dara's death, neighboring farmers reinforced their coops and improved safety measures. His family eventually sold the property and moved closer to town. The incident became a cautionary tale, though little concrete action was taken beyond the immediate village. I keep thinking about that moment in the coop, how tiny it was. Dara didn't expect a python that large, and the confined space made escape impossible. It's hard not to feel the situation could have been avoided if he hadn't gone in, alone that night. The signs were there, the risk obvious, but I guess sometimes pride and worry about your livelihood make you take chances you shouldn't. I can't say it was careless. It was human, but yeah, this one was preventable. It was July 18th, 2015, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines of Yellowstone National Park, where the summer tourist season had brought thousands of visitors eager to photograph the park's famous wildlife. The parking area near Dunraven Pass was crowded with vehicles as families hoped to catch glimpses of the black bears and grizzlies that frequently foraged in the area's berry-rich meadow. The park had thoughtfully provided a mandatory safety orientation for all visitors. Clara Martinez had skipped it. Clara Martinez was a 27-year-old marketing coordinator from Phoenix, Arizona, whose vacation planning consisted primarily of researching the most Instagram-worthy locations rather than understanding the environments she intended to visit. She had skipped the orientation specifically to get to scenic locations before other tourists, which, in retrospect, was an interesting set of priorities. Clara had spent the morning driving through the park's interior roads, frustrated by the distance between herself and the animals she encountered. Other tourists photographed elk and bison from the required 25-yard minimum distance without complaint. Clara found this approach insufficiently dramatic. When she spotted a large grizzly bear foraging near the tree line, she saw an opportunity for the kind of close-up shot that would generate serious social media engagement, and made a series of decisions that would also generate serious consequences. The bear, a mature female grizzly weighing approximately 300 to 350 pounds, had been feeding on huckleberries in a meadow adjacent to the parking area. Park rangers had been monitoring the animal throughout the week, noting her increasing comfort around human activity and her tendency to investigate vehicles for food sources. Clara had signed a form at the park entrance acknowledging that feeding wildlife was both illegal and dangerous. She then drove to the meadow and prepared to feed the wildlife. She parked approximately 30 feet from the bear, rolled down her passenger window, and began making clicking sounds while waving a granola bar out the window. The bear looked up from her foraging, immediately focusing on the scent of processed food. From the bear's perspective, a person had parked nearby and was waving food at her. This was not a confusing situation. Grizzly bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting food sources from over a mile away. An adult female can weigh between 290 and 400 pounds, with powerful limbs capable of propelling them at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. Their claws can reach up to 4 inches in length, and their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. The bear approached with deliberate steps, her massive head swaying as she tested the air. Clara held the granola bar further outside the window, attempting to coax the bear closer for a better shot. The bear rose on her hind legs, placed her front paws on the car's doorframe, and brought her massive head level with Clara's window. The bear's weight caused the car door to creak ominously, her claws leaving deep gouges in the paint as she repositioned for a better angle at the food. When Clara tried to pull the granola bar back inside the vehicle, the bear lunged toward the open window, pressing her head and shoulders against the door. The bear's claws raked across Clara's chest and arms as she struggled, tearing through her shirt and opening deep lacerations across her torso. Clara screamed and tried to push the bear away. The bear, weighing approximately 350 pounds, was not pushed away. Clara managed to open the driver's side door and attempted to escape, but the bear's weight pressed against the door frame, limiting her movement and trapping her against the passenger seat. The animal's massive paw struck Clara across the side of her head with devastating force, fracturing her skull and sending her glasses flying. The blow caused immediate severe trauma. her vision darkening as she slumped against the seat. The bear bit down on Clara's left shoulder and neck, powerful jaws crushing through muscle and bone. The bite severed her carotid artery, and blood began pouring from the wound at an alarming rate. Clara's attempts to scream were reduced to gurgling sounds as the bear shook her violently, the way a predator dispatches prey. Other tourists in the parking area began honking their horns and shouting, but the commotion came too late. The bear had dragged Clara partially out of the vehicle through the driver's side door, her body limp and unresponsive. By the time park rangers arrived with bear spray and firearms, Clara had lost consciousness from massive blood loss and traumatic injuries. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call, but Clara was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be exsanguination from the severed carotid artery, combined with catastrophic head trauma and crush injuries to her chest and neck. Park authorities euthanized the bear after determining that her escalating food conditioning posed an unacceptable risk to visitor safety. Clara, who had created that food conditioning through deliberate and illegal feeding, had paid the ultimate price. The incident prompted Yellowstone to implement stricter enforcement of wildlife interaction regulation and increase the penalties for feeding animals. It was August 15, 2014, and the ancient ice of a glacier stretched across Alaska's temperate wilderness like a frozen river of time, constantly calving into the lake below. The retreating ice had exposed rocky moraine and emerging vegetation, creating prime foraging habitat for brown bear preparing for winter. Celeste Moorhead, 44, arrived at the glacier viewing area that morning as part of a desperate attempt to repair her fractured relationship with her 19-year-old daughter Emma during an Alaskan cruise excursion. A real estate agent from Phoenix, she had spent years watching her only child drift away, their relationship strained by boundary violations and attention-seeking behaviors. Colleagues knew her as domineering, successful professionally, but personally toxic. The trip represented Celeste's last attempt to prove she could change, though arguments over control of the itinerary had already begun. Her daughter had reluctantly agreed after months of guilt-laden calls, but their tentative reconciliation was fraying under Celeste's need to document every moment for social media validation. The glacier viewing area sat surrounded by dense rainforest, where spruce and hemlock trees provided cover for Southeast Alaska's brown bear population. Alaskan brown bears can exceed 1,500 pounds during peak season, with females averaging around 500 pounds. They can accelerate from standing to high speeds within seconds when defending cubs. Their massive claws and powerful jaws evolve to catch salmon and eliminate threats to their offspring. Park naturalist Jacinth Marinin had begun her standard wildlife safety briefing by informing the 20-person tour group about a female brown bear with 2 yearling cubs spotted that morning near the glacier viewpoint, approximately 400 meters from the visitor center. She emphasized the critical importance of maintaining at least 100 yards distance from all bears, explaining how sows with cubs represented the most dangerous encounter scenario due to their hypersensitive protective instincts. Celeste interrupted Jacinth's safety presentation multiple times, loudly dismissing the warnings as overblown liability protection designed to limit tourist experiences. When the group spotted the sow and her cubs through binoculars at approximately 150 meters distance, Celeste pushed to the front and announced her intention to capture real photographs rather than tourist snapshots. Both Jacinth and Emma pleaded with her to respect the safety guidelines, but Celeste exploded in fury, screaming that she was paying good money for this experience and would not be controlled by government bureaucrats who clearly did not understand her needs as a paying customer. Despite increasingly desperate pleas from Emma and direct orders from Jacinth to remain on the marked trail, Celeste stormed away from the group toward the foraging bears. Emma's tears and Jacinth's radio calls to park headquarters went ignored as Celeste marched across the rocky terrain with her digital camera extended. Celeste approached the sow foraging while her cubs played nearby on the glacier-polished rocks. The massive bear immediately detected the threat, rising onto her hind legs and huffing a clear warning to retreat. Celeste continued forward with her camera raised, either failing to recognize or deliberately ignoring the unmistakable signs of an agitated mother defending her young. A brown bear sow protecting cubs doesn't just attack, she eliminates threats with extreme prejudice. Her attacks are designed not to wound, but to neutralize completely, often continuing long after the threat has stopped moving. Celeste had just triggered every maternal instinct evolution had hardened into this 500-pound killing machine. The bear responded defensively, advancing toward Celeste and making physical contact. She fell onto the rocky terrain and sustained multiple injuries to the head, neck, shoulders, and upper torso, including puncture wounds and lacerations from the bear's teeth and claws. During the encounter, the bear maintained contact for several minutes while attempting to neutralize the perceived threat to her cubs. Celeste's movements toward safety were hindered by the injuries sustained, which included deep tissue trauma consistent with defensive behavior by a large mammal protecting offspring. Celeste became unresponsive as blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma affected her condition. After perceiving that the immediate threat to her cubs had ended, the bear retreated with the cubs toward the surrounding tree line. Tour guides immediately radioed local emergency services. First responders arrived by helicopter, but Celeste had already died due to the severity of the injuries and hemorrhage. The coroner's examination confirmed extensive puncture wounds and lacerations to the head, neck, shoulders, and upper torso, consistent with a defensive attack by a brown bear. Death was determined to be caused by traumatic injuries, blood loss, and shock. Regional wildlife authorities concluded that the attack was a defensive response, triggered by human proximity and violation of established safety protocols. The bear family was monitored but not relocated, as their behavior was consistent with natural maternal defense. It was the late afternoon of August 6, 2013, in a private game reserve in the Limpopo province of South Africa, where the bush was dry and the grass had turned yellow from months without rain. Near the reserve's northern boundary, a small group of spotted hyenas had been feeding on a carcass since midday. Animals move differently when water is scarce. Johan van Rensburg, 44, was a South African safari guide with over 15 years of experience in the Limpopo bushveld. Widely respected among colleagues, he had guided hundreds of clients through the same terrain without incident. That familiarity had also produced a quiet confidence in his own judgment, a belief that he could read a situation accurately enough to act where others would not. I think this is one of the most dangerous places a person in the field can end up. Not ignorance, but the kind of experience that starts to feel like immunity. Understanding how animals behave from a vehicle, or with clients, or in the dozens of situations that resolved without incident is not the same as being on foot, alone, at a feeding site, with no deterrent and no backup. Johan received a report that hyenas had been active near the northern fence line with signs of a fresh kill. He decided to investigate on foot, alone. Before nightfall, he told a colleague he would be back within the hour. That detail, telling someone he would be back within the hour, suggests he understood there was some level of risk involved. He simply believed that his experience was sufficient to manage it. That belief was the error. Spotted hyenas are highly social and intelligent animals, and their behavior around an active kill is something I think most people, even experienced guides, underestimate. A clan at a feeding site is in a state of heightened arousal, competitive and territorial, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush the femur of a large ungulate cleanly. What makes them particularly dangerous in a group is not just their physical capability, but their coordination. They test, they flank, and they escalate in stages. If the test is not answered correctly, the next stage follows almost automatically. Johan located the feeding site, roughly half a mile from the fence line, and counted at least 6 animals. The constant whooping and giggling vocalizations went quiet the moment he arrived. That silence was a signal Johan recognized. He had heard it before from vehicles. He had never heard it while standing on foot, and from what I've studied, that distinction matters enormously. The animals were not ignoring him. They were assessing him. The nearest animal turned to face him fully, head low, shoulders raised. 2 others shifted to his sides without approaching. Johan took a slow step backward. The nearest animal took a step forward. He recognized the escalation and began backing away more deliberately. But what he misread was the animal that had circled wide through the brush and was now less than 15 feet behind him. That is the part of this story that I find most significant. Johan was reading the situation in front of him, tracking the animal facing him, monitoring the 2 that had flanked him. He was doing what an experienced guide would do, but the hyena behind him had moved through the brush without making a sound, and by the time Johan knew it was there, the distance was already gone. The bite came from behind, catching him across the back of his right thigh. He spun and struck the animal hard across the snout. It released and backed off, vocalizing loudly. The rest of the clan responded to the sound. The intimidation phase was over. Johann fought back. He was large and physically strong, but on the ground, outnumbered, without any deterrent, the situation deteriorated quickly. He sustained bites to both legs, his abdomen, and his right hand before a reserve patrol vehicle approached on a nearby track, and the animals scattered. The sound of the vehicle was enough. The hyenas moved into the brush and were gone. That speed of dispersal is something I think about in the context of what Johann had been trying to do. He had gone out there believing he could manage the situation on foot. A vehicle, just the sound of one, accomplished in seconds what he could not accomplish at all. The patrol team reached him within minutes. He was alive and conscious, telling them what had happened. The wounds to his abdomen were the most serious. He died en route to the reserve's medical post from blood loss, with the abdominal injuries identified as the primary factor. He had been conscious long enough to describe the encounter, which means he knew in those final minutes exactly what had happened and why. The reserve issued updated protocols prohibiting solo foot approaches to active predator feeding sites under any circumstances, regardless of experience level. Johann recognized the silence. It was September 22, 2017, and a low overcast had settled over the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of gray midday sky that makes everything feel slightly muted. The temperature was mild, unremarkable, the sort of weather that doesn't stay in your memory. What happened inside a modified garage on a quiet suburban street that afternoon, however, is not the kind of thing that leaves easily. Melissa Grant, 29, lived alone in a home she had gradually adapted around the needs of her most unusual resident. She worked remotely, kept to herself, and by most accounts was thoughtful and organized. Someone who had researched primate care extensively before acquiring the animal and continued reading long after. She had obtained the chimpanzee years earlier, before Oklahoma began tightening its primate ownership laws following a series of high-profile incidents across the country. Under the older framework, private ownership existed in a regulatory gap that was wide enough to drive through without much friction. Melissa had done everything that was technically required of her at the time. That's part of what makes this so hard to categorize. The chimpanzee she kept was an adult male, weighing approximately 140 pounds. That number sounds manageable until you understand what it means in practice. Chimpanzees are not exotic pets in the way people sometimes imagine. Curious, trainable, manageable, with the right approach. Their upper body musculature is dense and fast twitch in ways that human anatomy simply isn't. Specialists in primate behavior are consistent and unambiguous. Private ownership of adult chimpanzees is not a question of whether a serious incident will occur, but when. The animal had already been showing signs of escalating territorial behavior, bending fixtures inside the enclosure, displacing objects during cleaning. Melissa had noted these changes. She hadn't altered her approach. I think she probably told herself she knew him well enough. That's a very human thing to believe, and it's almost never true with an animal like this. On the morning of September 22nd, she entered the enclosure for midday cleaning, removing food containers and replacing them with fresh supplies. It was a task she had performed hundreds of times. The attack began as items were being removed, a pattern consistent with territorial or possession-triggered responses documented in chimpanzee behavior research. Once initiated, the escalation was rapid. Impact marks on the interior walls and overturned containers indicated the violence of what unfolded in that confined space. A chimpanzee of that size, in a territorial state, in an enclosed room, there was no realistic path to escape. A neighbor reported several loud impacts from inside the structure, then silence. Authorities conducted a welfare check after failed contact attempts. The animal was sedated before anyone entered. Melissa was found inside the enclosure. Death was ruled accidental due to traumatic injuries. Local authorities informally tightened restrictions on primate ownership in the area following the incident, though formal legislation remained limited. I've read a lot about chimpanzee incidents in the course of putting these stories together, and the one thing that strikes me every time is how the warning signs are almost always present and almost always misread. Not ignored exactly, misread. Melissa saw the changes in the animal's behavior. She interpreted them as manageable. That gap between observation and action is where these tragedies tend to live. It was May 17, 2013, and the dense banana plantation across Costa Rica's Limon province had become a maze where hidden dangers lurked among towering stalks. One of Central America's deadliest snakes lay motionless in the undergrowth, waiting for a worker to pass too close. Mateo Rivas, 38, had 15 years on the plantations, moving faster than most through thick foliage. That morning, he aimed to finish early for extra overtime. His confidence in familiar terrain made him underestimate the danger waiting ahead, perfectly camouflaged. I keep thinking about how that familiarity probably blinded him to the predator lurking silently. The section Mateo worked was dense, with sunlight barely reaching the ground and fallen leaves hiding a massive fer-de-lance. Recent rain had pushed wildlife closer, and vipers had been spotted nearby. Warnings and signs of disturbed foliage should have made him cautious, but he moved efficiently, machete in hand, unaware of the predator just feet away. I can picture him stepping through the undergrowth, confident, yet blind to the danger ahead. The viper struck without warning. Mateo's left foot landed within striking distance, and the snake's fangs sank deep into his lower leg, injecting a massive dose of hemotoxic venom. The initial shock was probably confusing. He might have thought he had stepped on a thorn or broken branch, but within moments, the pain became unbearable. A burning, spreading agony that radiated up his leg. Swelling rose quickly, discoloration darkening the surrounding tissue, and a creeping sense of dread set in. I can't imagine the realization hitting him. The sharp, shocking understanding that this was no ordinary injury, that something lethal had pierced him, and there was nothing he could do to escape the consequences. Each heartbeat must have amplified the fear. Each second, a reminder of the venom coursing through his veins, systematically destroying tissue and attacking his very life. He tried to keep working, tried to push through, but the venom spread quickly. His legs swelled grotesquely, blood failed to clot, and tissue destruction began almost immediately. His heart raced, dizziness set in, and strength drained from his limbs. When his co-workers reached him, he was barely able to sit upright, against a banana stalk. I can picture the panic in their eyes as they tried to carry him toward the road, knowing every moment counted, the hours stretching agonizingly as his body betrayed him. The journey to the clinic was brutal. Mateo's condition worsened with every step. Internal bleeding, shock, and organ strain left him barely conscious. By the time he arrived, massive envenomation and tissue destruction had overwhelmed him. Even with anti-venom and urgent care, it was too late. I keep imagining how powerless he must have felt, his body giving out with nothing able to stop it. The remote location and poor roads had made rapid help impossible. Doctors confirmed complete tissue necrosis, blood vessel damage, and systemic organ failure. I can't stop picturing that morning. The rustling banana leaves, the oppressive quiet after his last step. Afterward, the plantation increased safety training and protective equipment requirements, but nothing could bring Mateo back. His family received compensation, though it couldn't replace his presence or income. Among co-workers, the incident left a lasting impression. Workers now approached dense patches with caution, remembering how quickly a familiar landscape could turn lethal. The plantation, once just a place of routine labor, became a reminder that hidden dangers could lurk in even the most mundane corners of life. It's haunting to imagine how ordinary work turned deadly in an instant, and how quickly a place he knew so well became lethal. I keep replaying it in my mind. The calm, the quiet, and then that single bite changing everything forever. Even today, I think about the patterns of the leaves, the shadows along the ground, and how the snake's camouflage allowed it to remain undetected until it was too late. It's a stark reminder that confidence and experience can never replace caution when you're dealing with forces far stronger than yourself. One wrong step, one overlooked warning, and the consequences are irreversible. It was January 22nd, 2014. The boundary fence of a private tiger reserve in Rajasthan runs for miles through flat, scrub-covered terrain that looks almost identical on both sides of the wire. Dry land, sparse vegetation, cracked soil. On one side, a service road used by contractors and utility workers. On the other side, a completely different story. Most people who took jobs like this didn't think twice about it. You show up, you fix what's broken, you go home. That's exactly how Dustin Ferris saw it. 51 years old, self-employed, spent most of his career doing agricultural fencing and livestock enclosures. Straightforward work, and he was good at it. This job came through a local labor broker. Repair a damaged section of the reserve's outer boundary. Work through a list of compromised posts, done in 3 days. He was given a basic site map and sent out alone. No supervisor, no partner, no check-in system. Just him, a white utility van loaded with tools and wire spools, and a fence that needed fixing. Except this wasn't a cattle farm, and that fence wasn't keeping cows in. Before we get into what happened, Bengal tigers. Adult males weigh between 400 and 570 pounds and stretch over 9 feet from nose to tail. Their bite force sits around 1,050 pounds per square inch, and their preferred kill method on large prey is a throat clamp. They bite down and hold until the animal stops breathing. Tigers are also known to pace fence lines, especially where prey animals gather near the boundary. And here's the part that really matters. A tiger that sees regular human activity along a fence line will start to clock it. The routine, the timing, the pattern. They're not just wandering around. They're paying attention. Dustin was out there alone every day for 2 days, and nothing happened. No sounds from the other side, no movement along the fence. Just dry heat and quiet. That kind of quiet can make you comfortable very fast. And out here, that's the last thing you want to be. On his first morning, he spotted fresh paw prints running along the inside of the fence. He didn't report them, didn't think much of it, or maybe didn't want to make a fuss on a new job. Either way, he went back the next day, and the day after that. He had 2 days of uneventful work behind him. The job was almost done. Maybe that's why the paw prints didn't feel urgent. When nothing has gone wrong yet, it's hard to imagine that it will. On the morning of the 22nd, he parked the van along the fence near the 3-mile marker. He slid the side door open, sat on the edge of the van floor with his measuring tape and tools around him, and began working on a leaning post from there, close enough to reach it without fully stepping out. It was just easier that way. The van's side door stayed open behind him. Think about what that looks like from the other side of the fence. A man sitting still in an open doorway. Same spot, same time, 3rd morning in a row. The tiger had been in the scrub on the other side of the fence, less than 20 feet away. There was a gap where 2 fence panels had separated, wide enough. It cleared that gap in a single movement. Dustin was sitting in the open doorway. The van, when it hit him, no time to react, no time to stand. The tiger seized him by the upper chest and throat simultaneously, 1 bite, full compression, and pulled him out of the van doorway in a single drag. His measuring tape was still in his hand when he was found. The van sat there with the side door open for the rest of the day. The radio on the dashboard kept transmitting on an open channel. Nobody was monitoring it. Nobody knew anything was wrong until Dustin didn't show up at the staging area that evening. A check-in call went unanswered. They assumed he'd gone home early. The following morning, a 2-person team drove out to find him. Van exactly where he'd left it. Side door open. Tools scattered on the floor. Radio still going. Dustin's body was recovered, 40 feet inside the fence line, partially consumed. The post-mortem confirmed asphyxiation from throat compression as the cause of death, with hemorrhage from the neck and upper chest as a contributing factor. The measuring tape was recovered at the point of initial contact, and the fence gap was documented. The labor broker was investigated for failing to brief workers on the risks of operating near the boundary, but no criminal charges were filed. The tiger was identified through paw print measurements, cross-referenced with the reserve's animal records, and was not removed. Dustin had been dead for nearly 30 hours before anyone found him. It was June 9, 2016, and the South Texas heat had settled over the scrubland outside Laredo like a weight that didn't lift, even as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day where shadows go flat and the air smells faintly of dust and dry grass. On a rural property set back from the main road, a chain-link enclosure sat behind a low outbuilding, its wooden support posts weathered from years of sun exposure. Victor Salinas, 42, had operated an unaccredited roadside animal exhibit on that property for several years. He wasn't a trained zoologist or a licensed facility operator. He was someone who had built something unconventional and kept building it, driven by a genuine fascination with animals that most people only ever see behind institutional glass. Texas law required registration with local authorities and liability insurance for dangerous wild animals, but enforcement varied heavily by county, and in the rural stretch outside Laredo, the paperwork existed somewhere between informal and non-existent. I don't say that to excuse what followed, but I think it matters for understanding how someone ends up in a situation like this. Passion and proximity are a combination that requires structure to be safe, and structure was something Victor's operation consistently lacked. The centerpiece of the property was an adult male African lion, weighing approximately 420 pounds. African lions are apex predators, built for explosive short-distance pursuit. They can accelerate to 50 miles per hour in seconds and are capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone without effort. What most people don't know is that lions are highly attuned to feeding schedules. In captivity, irregular timing doesn't make them calmer. It makes them more reactive, more alert to the moment food arrives, and more likely to respond to entry as a feeding trigger rather than a routine interaction. Victor's feeding times were inconsistent, sometimes delayed by hours. That inconsistency in an animal of this size and temperament was not a minor detail. No secondary containment barriers had been installed. Neighbors had raised concerns more than once about the fencing and the practice of entering the enclosure during feeding rather than using an external delivery system. Standard safety practices for large predator management are unambiguous on this point. Shared space feeding is not a procedure, it's a gamble. Victor had taken that gamble many times. On June 9th, the odds caught up. The afternoon had already run long. Feeding was delayed past its usual window, and Victor entered the enclosure carrying exposed raw meat, the same way he had done countless times before. I keep coming back to that phrase, the same way he had done countless times before. It appears in almost every one of these cases, and every time it means the same thing. The routine had become the risk. The lion advanced the moment Victor stepped through the gate, closing the distance before the food could be placed. The response was immediate and consistent with a feeding-triggered reaction in a large predator that had been waiting past its expected mealtime. Disturbed ground and drag marks near the entry point told the story of what followed. The attack happened fast, within a short distance of where Victor had entered, leaving almost no time between the gate closing and the moment everything changed. Nearby residents reported a brief animal disturbance, then silence. Victor was found later that evening by a family member. The lion was euthanized on site by responding authorities, and the property was shut down immediately. The incident prompted a local review of privately maintained exotic animal enclosures in the region, though the findings were largely informal. There's something about this case that I find particularly difficult to sit with. Victor had been doing this for years. The lion had never seriously injured anyone. And that history, I think, was exactly the problem. Every uneventful feeding made the next one feel safer than it was, until the one that wasn't. It was October 14th, 2015, in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness of southern Montana. The terrain consisted of dense lodgepole pine mixed with open meadows, and recent snowmelt had left the ground soft and quiet underfoot. Leland Wickham was 34 years old, a machinist from Billings who had drawn an elk tag after years of applying. He had been hunting for nearly a decade, but had limited experience in grizzly country. He was carrying a compound bow, a canister of bear spray, and basic camping gear. His plan was to hunt a drainage, known locally for elk activity during the rut. The fog had begun to lift slightly as he moved deeper into the area, though visibility remained limited in the dense timber. He moved slowly, scanning for elk sign and listening for movement in the brush. Leland had been walking for some time when he spotted a well-used game trail cutting through a meadow. Fresh tracks pressed into the soft earth indicated recent elk activity, and he followed the trail deeper into the drainage. The wind was blowing steadily from the northwest. The forest around him was quiet except for the occasional call of a raven overhead and the soft crunch of his boots on damp ground. The area showed thick cover and multiple escape routes. He moved higher, staying just inside the tree line to avoid being silhouetted against the open meadow. As he walked, he noticed more elk dropping and fresh rubs on several small pines, where bulls had scraped their antlers against the bark. The terrain began to slope downward into a narrow draw filled with willows and scattered deadfall. Leland stepped over a rotting log and entered a small clearing no more than 30 feet across. The ground here was churned up, likely from elk feeding on the vegetation. He stopped to examine the tracks more closely, kneeling down to run his fingers over the impressions in the mud. The grizzly bear is one of North America's largest land predators, with adult males weighing between 400 and 790 pounds. They can run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour over short distances and possess immense strength. Grizzlies are highly territorial and extremely protective of food sources, often returning to cached kills over multiple days. Leland stood and continued through the clearing, moving toward the far edge where the brush thickened again. He caught movement ahead through the trees. A large grizzly stood near a deer carcass he had passed earlier, roughly 40 feet away. The bear's head lifted, and it locked eyes with him. Leland froze. The bear dropped to all fours and began moving toward him, ears pinned back. He reached for his bear spray and managed to pull it from the holster. The bear broke into a charge, closing the distance in seconds. The impact knocked Leland onto his back before he could deploy the spray. The canister flew from his hand and landed several feet away. The bear's jaws clamped onto his left shoulder and teeth punctured through his jacket and into muscle. He tried to roll onto his stomach to protect his vital organs, but the bear's weight pinned him in place. The bear released his shoulder and bit down on his upper back, just below the neck. The force fractured his scapula and tore through soft tissue. His right arm went limp. The bear shifted its position and bit into his side, tearing through his ribcage. Leland's legs kicked weakly against the ground, his boots scraping through the mud and leaves. The bear continued its assault, biting repeatedly at his torso and limbs. Leland's body convulsed as shock set in from the massive trauma. His breathing became rapid and shallow, then irregular. The attack lasted approximately 45 seconds of continuous mauling before the bear suddenly stopped and moved back toward its cached deer carcass. Leland lay motionless in the clearing, his body broken and bleeding heavily. He lost consciousness within seconds from blood loss and shock. He died roughly 3 minutes after the attack ended, alone in the clearing, as the bear fed on its original kill 30 feet away. The bear remained in the area for several hours. Evidence later suggested it returned to Leland's body after dark and fed on the remains before dragging what was left into dense brush approximately 50 yards from the attack site. Leland had told a friend he would check in by radio that evening. When no contact was made, the friend drove to the trailhead the following morning and found Leland's truck still parked. A search was organized, and his body was located the next day. Evidence at the scene included deep claw marks on his torso, severe tissue damage to his shoulder and back, and catastrophic injuries throughout his body. Significant tissue loss indicated the bear had returned to feed after death. His bow was found lying in the clearing near the initial contact point, and the bear spray canister was located several feet away, unused. The deer carcass nearby showed signs of recent feeding, and large tracks consistent with an adult male grizzly were documented throughout the area. It was March 14, 2015, and a wide African river flowed through a remote region inhabited by one of the continent's most dangerous mammals. The river appeared calm on the surface, but local hippos maintained territorial zones that had caused previous human fatalities. Vera Caldwell, 42, arrived in the region 6 days earlier, determined to prove herself after a bitter divorce and an inheritance that left her financially secure. Known at her school for constant dissatisfaction, she approached the 8-day eco-tour as a personal declaration of independence. Her fellow travelers quickly grew weary of her non-stop complaints about accommodations, meals, and prices. She spent days antagonizing veteran river guide Jonas Mwanza, dismissing his safety warnings as fear-mongering, all while documenting grievances for scathing online reviews. This river system harbors one of Africa's densest hippopotamus populations, with pods of 10 to 30 individuals claiming territorial stretches of shallow water where they spend daylight hours submerged to protect their sensitive skin. Adult bulls can exceed 4,000 pounds and achieve surprising speed both in water and on land. Their massive jaws evolved to crush riverbank vegetation and unfortunate intruders with equal efficiency. These deceptively docile-looking animals kill more humans annually than lions, leopards, and crocodiles combined. Their unpredictable aggression triggered by perceived threats to their territory or young. Jonas had begun the morning safety briefing by pointing to a pod of hippos visible 100 meters upstream, their ears and eyes barely breaking the surface as they monitored the approaching canoes. He explained their territorial nature and the critical importance of maintaining distance, but Vera interrupted repeatedly, accusing him of ruining the experience with unnecessary paranoia. When Jonas explained that hippos were capable of biting through wooden canoes, Vera laughed dismissively and stated she had not paid premium prices to avoid wildlife encounters. Her canoe partner, a soft-spoken retiree named Margaret, pleaded quietly for caution as they launched into the current. As the group of 6 canoes approached the hippopod, Jonas signaled for everyone to paddle toward the opposite bank, but Vera demanded Margaret steer directly toward the animals. She stood unsteadily in the narrow canoe, phone extended for video footage, shouting at the other tourists to stop being babies and get closer for dramatic shots. Jonas's repeated warnings were ignored as Vera directed Margaret to paddle closer, bringing the canoe to within approximately 15 meters of the hippopod. What Vera didn't understand was that hippos can hold their breath underwater for up to 5 minutes, allowing them to approach threats completely submerged and invisible. The bull monitoring their canoe had already begun his approach beneath the murky surface, tracking their movements through vibrations and sound. The incident began when Vera stood in the canoe, causing it to become unstable. The sudden shift disrupted the vessel's balance, and both occupants were thrown into the river. The bull hippopotamus erupted from below, its massive jaws clamping down on Vera's torso, inflicting severe injuries to the upper body, including punctures and contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. She was quickly submerged, and her phone was lost during the incident. Following the initial bite, the bull resurfaced and lunged again in short, forceful bursts. Witnesses observed repeated surges in the same area, each resulting in additional impact and forced submersion. The pattern was consistent with territorial, defensive behavior. Margaret remained on the overturned canoe and called for help while maintaining distance. Vera's body resurfaced intermittently in the turbulent water. Observers noted limited movement following the initial impact, consistent with severe trauma and water inhalation. After several forceful surges, the bull disengaged and moved toward deeper water. Vera was left unresponsive in the river. The tour guide quickly directed the remaining canoes to safety and radioed base camp. Local fishermen arrived approximately 12 minutes later, followed by park rangers 18 minutes later. Rescue personnel took approximately 45 minutes to locate Vera's body, found wedged against fallen tree branches roughly 200 meters from the attack site. The coroner's examination revealed massive internal trauma, including multiple rib fractures, punctured lungs, and severe tissue damage to the torso and abdomen. Death occurred from drowning combined with traumatic injury. Vera's death received minimal coverage in Zambian newspapers. Her family struggled with bureaucratic delays in repatriating the body, while the tour company quietly settled with Margaret for her injuries and psychological trauma. The incident underscored the risks associated with close proximity to territorial wildlife. Just over a year later, high in the Himalayas, another woman's pursuit of social media fame would put her in the path of a stealthy, deadly predator, an Indian leopard stalking the pilgrimage trails. It was September 23, 2016. The Kedarnath pilgrimage trail in Uttarakhand passed through mountainous terrain at elevations approaching 12,000 feet. The narrow path, carved into cliffsides, was used regularly by pilgrims and visitors. Mae James, 38, arrived in the region 3 days earlier, carrying more camera equipment than survival gear. A freelance travel blogger from Portland, she had been struggling financially, and her online following had plateaued despite increasingly desperate attempts at viral content. She live-streamed sunrise yoga poses and pseudo-philosophical reflections, ignoring local customs and guidance. Villagers and fellow travelers grew weary of her condescending attitude and constant complaints about accommodations, insisting on special treatment as a content creator. Her presence during peak pilgrimage season marked her last attempt to salvage her failing blog. She clashed repeatedly with guides over safety protocols, dismissing warnings about weather and wildlife as superstition, while alienating other pilgrims with staged controversies and manufactured authenticity. The Kedarnath region harbors a significant population of Indian leopards, solitary predators capable of reaching 150 pounds and possessing bite forces exceeding 400 pounds per square inch. These cats are perfectly adapted mountain hunters, capable of dragging prey twice their weight up vertical cliff faces and remaining completely silent while stalking through dense rhododendron forests. Unlike their African cousins, Indian leopards have adapted to high-altitude hunting and show increased aggression during monsoon season when their natural prey becomes scarce. Village elder Ramesh had warned the evening group about a man-eating leopard that had killed a goat herder 3 weeks earlier near the trail's most dangerous section. The animal had shown unusual boldness, attacking during daylight and displaying no fear of human presence. Ramesh emphasized the critical importance of traveling in groups and avoiding the trail after sunset. Maya interrupted repeatedly, calling him a fear-mongering patriarch and accusing the village of perpetuating superstitious nonsense to maintain their patriarchal grip on spiritual tourism. When 2 young volunteers approached Mae at 7:15 p.m. to discourage her planned solo evening hike, she became increasingly hostile. She announced loudly to her live stream audience that she would not be mansplained or spiritually gatekeepered by backward locals who clearly did not understand her authentic journey. Mae declared her intention to hike alone at dusk for better lighting and genuine solitude, dismissing the volunteers' pleas as attempts to control her spiritual experience. She stormed away from the rest house at 7:30 p.m. with her phone camera rolling, determined to capture content that would finally make her travel blog profitable. Mae walked along the mountain path around 8:15 p.m., using her phone camera while adjusting settings for low-light conditions. Near a sharp switchback bordered by dense rhododendron bushes, a 150-pound male leopard was present in the vicinity. The leopard had been moving through the undergrowth and positioned itself on a rock outcropping approximately 8 feet above the trail. Leopards possess exceptional night vision, approximately 6 times better than humans, and their spotted coats provide perfect camouflage in dappled mountain shadows. May never stood a chance of seeing the predator watching her from above, its golden eyes tracking every movement as she fumbled with her phone's camera settings. The leopard descended from the rock and struck her from behind, knocking her forward onto the rocky trail. Its foreclaws secured her shoulders while its jaws closed at the base of her neck. Her phone fell from her hand, ending the live stream. The leopard adjusted its grip, maintaining pressure as she struggled beneath its weight. The leopard maintained its grip on her throat, applying sustained pressure consistent with large feline killing behavior. As trauma and airway compression progressed, her resistance weakened. After she became unresponsive, the animal secured her by the shoulder and dragged her off the trail into denser brush. May sustained extensive trauma to multiple areas during the attack, which contributed to significant blood loss and impaired mobility. Local searchers later located her backpack, scattered fragments of her phone, and other personal items along the path. Her body was subsequently recovered further down the ravine. The coroner's examination confirmed trauma to the neck, shoulders, and upper back consistent with predation by a large feline. Death resulted from blood loss, shock, and blunt force injuries. Local newspapers reported the incident briefly as a tourist fatality. Regional authorities increased patrols along the trail following the incident.